Marvel. Start with Betty Ross as my girlfriend. Chapter 61. After getting off the plane and walking out of the airport, Jo-young suddenly sobered up when the cold morning wind blew on him. What was wrong with him? Why, knowing that Thor was very likely already on Earth, did he still rush over? Yes, why did he need to come to New Mexico? What was going to happen in New Mexico was nothing more than the story of Thor, who was banished to Earth, meeting his true love Jane Foster, and then defeating the villain Loki with the help of the warriors Three and Sif. And on the surface, the fighting was intense, and Loki even controlled Asgard's powerful weapon, the Destroyer. However, few people knew that all of this was actually under Odin's control. How could the Destroyer be so easily taken control of by others? One must know that it was Odin's own armor back then. So, all of this was arranged by Odin. What was the point of Jo-young rushing over now? Given his identity, even with this deliberate approach to Thor now, after his identity is exposed in the future, he will still stand against the Avengers. So, contact between them is unnecessary. As for the warriors Three and Sif, their eyes are only on Thor. Perhaps he could poach Thor's corner and get closer to Jane Foster. After all, no matter what, she is the future female Thor. Moreover, with the emergence of the ether, Jane Foster is also a very important character. And the only gain Jo-young might get is to learn from the Destroyer. After all, that was the armor Odin used to conquer the 9 realms. If Jo-young wants to gain something in this regard, it is best to follow the Asgardian path. Perhaps he can get some runes from the fragments of the Destroyer that he didn't know about before. This is the only key that can promote the growth of his strength. Sitting in the taxi, Jo-young closed his eyes and thought for a long time, planning his goals and plans for this trip. However, even though he had arrived in New Mexico, Jo-young still needed to expend some effort to get to the town where the incident occurred. The city Jo-young was in was Albuquerque, the largest city in New Mexico, while the actual incident occurred deep in the desert to the north. Actually, finding the town where the incident occurred accurately is not difficult at all, as long as you can find the trick. The people who know the most about these matters here are not the residents of the local bar, nor are they intelligence dealers, but local newspaper reporters. They are the ones who know best what new things happen locally every moment. They can always get first-hand news as soon as possible. Kassam, the town closest to where Thor's hammer fell, is the town of Kassam. It took Jo-young half a day to get to the town of Kassam, and then he asked the locals about the location of Thor's hammer before rushing over. He had to be quick. If he was any slower, the people from S.H.I.E.L.D. might arrive. Jo-young had no covetous desires for Thor's hammer. He knew that no matter when, Thor's hammer belonged to Thor. Even without mentioning Mjolnir, the self-aware entity within Thor's hammer, the destiny that Odin placed upon it kept it tightly intertwined with Thor. Moreover, for countless years, Thor was the one who could truly unleash the power of Thor's hammer. Even Odin and Hela could not compare in this regard. Therefore, even though Thor's hammer was eventually destroyed, it was still not taken away by Hela. However, although Thor's hammer was later destroyed by Hela, Mjolnir merely changed its external shell. So, for Jo-young, all he could do was observe as much as possible whether there were any special magic runes on the surface of Thor's hammer that he could learn from, such as the words Odin personally carved on it. If there were 1 or 2 magic runes that Jo-young had never seen before, then he would have made a huge profit. However, before Jo-young could even touch Thor's hammer, he saw Phil Coulson standing on the high slope in the distance, along with several other S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. Undoubtedly, these people would immediately clear the area, driving away everyone currently gathered around Thor's hammer. At that point, it would be even more difficult for Jo-young to get close to Thor's hammer. A rented large pickup truck carried Jo-young and quickly stopped in front of the huge crater. The locals couldn't help but hesitate at his unfamiliar face, but then, under the 2 cases of beer Jo-young moved from the truck, they completely forgot that he was a stranger. Holding a bottle of beer in his hand, Jo-young mumbled something vaguely to the others, but without anyone noticing, he quietly reached the front of Thor's hammer. At this moment, on the ground, a rock pillar stood abruptly, supporting a silver divine hammer that had fallen from the sky. It wasn't that no one had thought of destroying this rock pillar and taking away the silver divine hammer, but strangely, this rock pillar, which should have been of the same nature as the surrounding sunken ground, had somehow become incredibly hard and indestructible. At the same time, it seemed to be directly connected to the depths of the earth. Someone tried to dig downwards, but in a short time, they couldn't dig very deep into the rocky ground. This was originally a desert, but due to the descent of Thor's hammer, it was directly compressed down by more than 10 meters due to the powerful force. It is unknown whether this was originally the rock layer beneath the desert or if the sand and gravel were recompressed into rock. Regardless, they were difficult to move. Compared to ordinary people, Jo-young only needed to glance to know exactly what had happened here. Indeed, the powerful force of Thor's hammer directly compressed the entire area, but what made this desert look like it does now was the powerful lightning force, especially the rock pillar beneath Thor's hammer, whose interior had already crystallized. This was the first time observing Thor's hammer up close. He did not easily reach out. At this time, even though Coulson and the others were discussing in low voices in the distance, anyone who dared to easily grasp the handle of Thor's hammer would immediately attract their attention. And for Jo-young, if he were just an ordinary person, touching Thor's hammer like this would definitely have no ill effects. But now, as a magician who inherited the rune magic of Asgard, who knows what would happen once he touched Thor's hammer. According to legend, the handle of Thor's hammer was forged from a branch of the world tree, but it is unknown whether it was because of the mixture of uru metal and mithril. Jo-young could not see any trace of wood structure. He could only see a silver hammer handle wrapped in circle after circle of dark brown long silk. However, none of this is important. What is truly important is the body of Thor's hammer. Thor's hammer, forged from the core of a dying star fused with uru and other precious metals, although it stood there looking so ordinary at this moment, Jo-young could feel the immense power contained within it. And what truly attracted him were the circles of runes on Thor's hammer. The 24 runes, Fehu, Urus, Thurasas, Ansus, Rado, Kanaz, Jibo, Wonjo, Hagalas, etc., were all intertwined in a complex manner, forming an extremely complex rune script, and using Thor's hammer as a carrier, constructing a powerful rune magic array. However, what truly played a role was not these 24 runes, but another rune carved on one side of the hammer body that was completely unfamiliar to Jo-young. This was a rune that Jo-young had never seen before. Undoubtedly, it was the thing that played a crucial controlling role in the entire Thor's hammer. The main body of Thor's hammer is the core of a dying star. God King Odin, who forged it, undoubtedly has the ability to use it, but this does not mean that Thor also has the ability to fully use Thor's hammer like Odin. To be blunt, Thor's strength is still far from his father Odin's. Without Odin's permission, Thor cannot even lift Thor's hammer, just as Odin can easily strip him of all his divine power, easily take away his Thor's hammer, and easily banish him to earth. Thor is still far from inheriting the position of king of the gods. It seemed to be the appearance of 3 special flat oval patterns intersecting each other. That was not the power of lightning, but rather a peculiar controlling force, a kind of ability that allows one to control Thor's hammer through this rune. After observing for a while, Jo-young finally made his judgment. That was not the lightning rune he had originally hoped to see, it was merely a control rune. Of course, this was not a simple control rune. It was used by Odin on Thor's hammer to control Thor's hammer. This rune would not have much effect on Jo-young's magic cultivation itself, but it could be used by him in other ways, to control other weapons, just like Thor controls Thor's hammer. It is even highly likely that after Jo-young masters this rune, he will have the opportunity to control Thor's hammer. Jo-young shook his head. Thor's hammer was out of the question. This item inherently belongs to Thor. If Jo-young were to obtain Thor's hammer, he would not only directly confront Thor, but even God King Odin and Loki would also turn their attention to him. One must know that back then, Loki had also coveted Thor's hammer, but in the end, it fell into Thor's hands. Jo-young reached out, attempting to grasp the handle of Thor's hammer. However, at that moment, the sound of cars came from a distance. Startled, Jo-young subconsciously withdrew his hand and looked into the distance. And at this moment, Coulson, who had seen Jo-young almost grasp the handle of Thor's hammer, secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Jo-young had actually been noticed by Coulson for a while. This person, whose face was somewhat unclear, had been circling Thor's hammer, yet he did not try to lift Thor's hammer like others. This abnormality naturally attracted Coulson's attention. However, Coulson's suspicion in his mind quickly ended, because he finally saw that after looking at Thor's hammer, the person whose face was unclear finally reached out to grasp Thor's hammer. But before he could see if that person could lift Thor's hammer, the sound of cars echoed in the distance, and dozens of black sedans appeared behind Coulson. SHIELD's support had arrived. You have to admit, SHIELD's power is truly immense. Before even a day had passed, they had already obtained a prohibition order from the New Mexico state governor, prohibiting anyone other than S.H.I.E.L.D. from approaching Thor's hammer. Everyone had to leave this place. It was quite fast. Under the forced expulsion by SHIELD's agents in black suits, the residents of the nearby small town could only grumble and leave, and Joe Young, mixed in with the crowd, also left this troublesome place. Having left Thor's hammer behind, Joe Yang's most important task now was to find out where Thor is currently. If nothing unexpected happens, Thor is now gathered with Jane Foster and her group. As long as he can find Jane Foster and her party, he can find Thor. As for whether to meet Thor, it is temporarily best to leave a good impression on him. After all, before Hydra jumps out, everyone can still get along well. Or, if Joe Yang's plan can be successfully implemented, this identity of his can also be maintained for a long time. However, since he plans to interact with Thor using this identity, Joe Young must consider the United States military aspect, as that is his protective umbrella. Thinking of this, Joe Young had a plan in mind. He took out his phone and dialed General Ross's number. This time, he might have to deal with Asgard's destroyer with Thor. Therefore, to gain a certain priority in the disposal of war spoils after the battle, he cannot do it without the support of the United States military. Whether it is Thor's hammer or the destroyer armor, they are Asgard's top-level combat weapons. Even as just a magician, Joe Young can absorb enough nutrients from these items to build his own set of war equipment. Don't look at Joe Young having his own magic staff now, and protective leather armor made from Jotunheim frost beasts, but the difference between these and Asgardian artifacts is the same as the difference between a wooden knife and wooden sword and the most advanced submachine gun. Joe Young drove his old pickup truck back into the small town. He would leave Thor's hammer to S.H.I.E.L.D., they wouldn't be able to figure anything out anyway. Actually, finding Jane Foster and her group is not difficult at all. Just by asking around a bit, you can find the 3 scientists who came from out of town. Moreover, Jane Foster has been rooted in this area for a considerable period. She is an expert in astrophysics, and New Mexico's high altitude, along with the clear night sky over the desert, can provide detailed and accurate data. Jane Foster has been studying the aurora storm for some time now. She followed an aurora storm to New Mexico and, after making significant discoveries, called Dr. Eric Shagway here as well. The house they rented is at the outer intersection. This is a place they deliberately chose, as they often return late at night. If they lived in the center of the small town, it would easily disturb the neighbors, which would in turn affect their research. This is a brand new small town. New Mexico is known as the land of enchantment. Even in the desert, there are landscapes for tourists to enjoy, and it is precisely because of this that small towns providing services to various people who come here have been established. There are quite a few people coming and going in the entire small town, but there are not many who are truly willing to settle here. Therefore, some policies here are very lenient, and every house is built very large. The 2-story building that Jane Foster and the 3 of them rented alone has an area of 400 to 500 square meters. Of course, more of that space is used to store some data and equipment. When Joe Young arrived, he happened to hear them discussing loudly, "Look at the luminous ring at the edge. This is a typical characteristic of an Einstein-Rosen bridge." What? Daisy Louise, who was just silly eating nearby, had no idea what they were talking about. At this time, Dr. Shagway was already immune to the ignorance of Daisy Louise, the political science student, but he still proactively introduced it to Daisy Louise, saying, "An Einstein-Rosen bridge is a theoretical channel connecting 2 spacetime points, which is a wormhole." "Oh, if you said wormhole, I would understand." Daisy Louise immediately realized, but then she added, "I'm not interested." Jane Foster, who was not surprised by anything Daisy Louise, who was only there as labor, said, picked up a photo from the table and asked Dr. Shagway, "Eric, tell me what you see." "Stars." Dr. Shagway didn't immediately understand what Jane Foster wanted to say. They had taken many photos when the sky anomaly occurred last night, and this was just one of them. "Yes, they are stars, but they are not our stars here." Jane Foster picked up more photos and placed them in front of Dr. Shagway, saying with suppressed excitement, "Look at the distribution of stars in our area at this moment. Unless Ursa Minor went on vacation, this is definitely the distribution of another constellation." Wait, Dr. Shagway seemed to have thought of something and immediately walked to the large display board in the living room. The display board had more than a dozen large photos pasted on it, showing starry skies with special patterns of light. Dr. Shagway couldn't help but say, "No, this is impossible." Jane Foster only needed to glance at it to immediately understand what it was. She immediately turned and walked quickly outside, saying at the same time, "Eric, we have to hurry over. We must see what that thing is before those people completely seal off the area." Earlier, when they were eating, they happened to hear someone say that it seemed a satellite had fallen in the desert last night. A group of people were playing and having fun there, competing in strength while also having a barbecue and drinking beer, until a group of federal agents arrived. It was those federal agents who told them that the item was a fragment from a satellite that fell from the sky and was highly radioactive, and then they chased away the locals who were gathered there. And what they said the most was that the item was very heavy, so heavy that none of them could lift it. Now Jane Foster understood. Whatever it was something that fell from the sky last night, or more accurately, from another space-time to Earth. They had to find those things, and preferably be able to get them from the federal agents, because that item had extremely high scientific value. They could even communicate with the American government about this. Jane Foster is British. She did her undergraduate studies at the Royal Institute of Technology in England, and later went to Imperial University in America for graduate school, even completing her doctorate and staying on to teach. And Dr. Shagway was her undergraduate advisor. Both of them have extensive connections in the academic circles of England and America. As long as they leverage their connections, it is not difficult to obtain such an extraterrestrial fallen object, as long as they can do so before those federal agents figure out what it is. Jo Young arrived just as this scene was unfolding. While listening to the conversation between the few people, he also quickly searched the entire two-story building. However, strangely, he did not find Thor here, not even a trace of Thor having been here. What's going on? Why isn't Thor here? Wait, Jo Young remembered that when Jane Foster and Thor first met, there seemed to be some conflict between them, and Thor was eventually sent to the hospital. Thor is in the hospital now, so are the three of them heading to the hospital now. Watching Jane Foster and the three of them get into the RV, Jo Young immediately hid in the dark and followed closely. He had originally planned to join their discussion under the pretense of passing by, but now it seems he needs to first determine Thor's location. However, what Jo Young did not expect was that Jane Foster did not go to the small town's hospital, but instead drove directly into the desert outside the small town. If Thor had not been placed in the small town's hospital, but in the hospital of the nearest city, that could be somewhat explained. But the direction Jane Foster and the others were heading was not towards the nearest city at all, but west, continuously towards the depths of the desert. One must know that Jo Young had just come back from there. What is in the desert to the west? Actually, nothing much, except that about 50 miles west of the small town, there happens to be a Thor's hammer. Jane Foster and her group were actually going directly to find Thor's hammer. Jo Young, hidden in the dark, couldn't help but frown. Shouldn't they be looking for Thor? Jo Young, in the dark, stopped. What could Jane Foster and her group gain from going to find Thor's hammer? That place had long been surrounded by SHIELD personnel. If they were facing normal federal agents, they might be able to communicate and discuss, but encountering those SHIELD people, it would be good enough if those guys didn't just kick them out directly. It's possible they will soon find their way here and take all of Jane Foster's research materials. At that time, they will truly have nothing but tears. Jo Young returned to the small town. There was no point in following them to find Thor's hammer. Instead of doing that, he might as well look for Thor's location in the small town. His first stop was the small town's hospital. However, Jo Young never expected that not only was there no trace of Thor in the small town's hospital, but there was also no sign of Thor in the entire small town, or even within a 10-kilometer radius. Where did that guy go? There's no Thor, indeed no Thor. Within a 10-kilometer radius of the entire town, there's no sign of Thor at all. Jo Young carefully searched every house and building here, searching thoroughly within a 10-kilometer radius, but there was simply no sign of Thor at all. Something must have gone wrong. Thor definitely came to Earth, and his location wouldn't be too far. Thor's hammer is in the desert not far away. Where else could he go? And Thor and Jane Foster are bound to meet, because no matter which universe dimension it is, Jane Foster eventually becomes the female thunder god. So, just wait. Wait for Jane Foster and Professor Shigav's group to return from deep in the desert. As long as he keeps a close eye on them, Jo Young will be able to accurately find Thor. Jo Young gradually cleared his thoughts. That's right, according to what he originally expected, Thor should have already met Jane Foster long ago, but he forgot that the Marvel Universe has countless dimensions. He didn't even know which dimension he himself was in, so how could he accurately determine the precise direction of events? Moreover, he had been in this world for many years, and had more or less had some impact on it. What's more, Odin already knew of his existence, and even released him from Jotunheim back to Earth one step before Thor arrived. There was a reason for this. It's very likely that Odin had already made changes in some minor details. Or perhaps Jo Young was overthinking all of this. Thor might be in a hospital in a nearby large city right now. It wouldn't be long before he would appear, and everything would develop as Jo Young was familiar with. Regardless, keeping a close eye on Jane Foster and Professor Shigav's group was definitely not wrong. However, Jo Young never expected that even after waiting until night, he still couldn't wait for the return of Jane Foster's group. His judgment was wrong again. According to his previous guess, Jane Foster and Professor Shigav had rushed to the location of Thor's hammer. Although they might have some conflict with S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel wouldn't do anything to them. At most, they would be reprimanded and then released. Perhaps it might be a little more excessive. S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel would confiscate all their information, and then there would be a bit more conflict between the two sides, but that would be it. S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel wouldn't do anything to a United States citizen who hadn't broken the law, and Jane Foster and Professor Shigav were completely helpless against S.H.I.E.L.D. But Jo Young's judgment was off. Logically speaking, Jane Foster and Professor Shigav should have returned from deep in the desert long ago, but they were still nowhere to be seen. This could only mean that something Jo Young didn't know about had definitely happened. He wouldn't wait any longer. Jo Young quickly drove the pickup truck he came in towards the location of Thor's hammer. He was a little worried that Thor might be there too. But not yet. Before Jo Young could get there to see Thor, he saw a striking firelight streak across the high altitude above him, descending towards the location of Thor's hammer. What is Tony Stark doing here? Jo Young slammed on the brakes. Why had Stark also rushed here this time? Originally, everything that happened here had nothing to do with him, right? After a slight hesitation, Jo Young finally chose to jump out of the car. He needed to sneak in quietly to see what unexpected things had happened. Everything was now beyond his expectations, so he had to be even more careful and cautious. In fact, Jo Young was not far from S.H.I.E.L.D.'s base now, and his own speed was not a bit slower than a car driving at full speed. In fact, if he went all out, his speed would likely be even faster. However, because he didn't want to casually consume the energy within his body on a normal basis, he would rely more on the use of tools. Under the cover of night, S.H.I.E.L.D. had already established a small base with a radius of several hundred meters, centered around Thor's hammer. Circle after circle of barbed wire had firmly enclosed the base, and there were dozens of S.H.I.E.L.D. agents constantly patrolling inside. Even at high points, there were people holding binoculars and sniper rifles monitoring further distances. Under the current circumstances, it was not easy for ordinary people to enter here easily, let alone that besides the outer barbed wire and S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s design for the entire base was also very defensive. Many bases were built around Thor's hammer, with 3-story high temporary mobile homes. The external exit passages of these mobile homes formed white spiral arms, firmly protecting the central temporary building in the center. If you've seen a simple plan view of the entire galaxy, you'll find that everything here really resembles the galaxy spiral arms. Under these circumstances, these passages became another line of defense. Anyone who wanted to enter the central temporary building had to pass through these passages, and within these passages, S.H.I.E.L.D. had also stationed countless skilled personnel quietly guarding. Jo Young climbed onto a high slope in the distance, gazing far away at everything inside. If he remembered correctly, Hawkeye Barton should be here right now. Hawkeye Barton, plus Iron Man Stark, a Thor who is very likely to appear, and if you also count Phil Coulson, who is in charge of managing all of this, then a little less than half of the Avengers group has already appeared here. Jo Young didn't stay on the periphery for long. He quickly and quietly infiltrated. With his ability, it was easy not to be discovered. Moreover, he didn't dare to stay on the periphery for long, because he didn't know if Loki had already arrived here at this time. Thor's banishment to Earth this time was originally planned by Loki alone. First, he secretly allowed the frost giants from Jotunheim to enter Asgard to steal the ancient winter coffin from Odin's secret vault, and then he provoked Thor to go to Jotunheim to establish his authority among the frost giants. Thor was severely beaten by Loki, then rescued by Odin and brought back to Asgard, finally making Odin completely disappointed with Thor, and then stripping him of his right of inheritance, even if it was only temporarily. However, even Loki didn't expect Odin to be so ruthless. Thor had only contradicted him a few times, and he directly banished Thor to Midgard. At this time, Loki decisively provoked Odin again, causing his old illness to relapse and him to re-enter the God King's sleep. Of course, Loki was most uneasy about Thor. What he least wanted was for Thor to return to Asgard, and if he could steal Thor's hammer, then even if Thor returned, he would not be his opponent. Jo-young could be said to be very careful. After sneaking into the central mobile building, he didn't directly rush in to touch Thor's hammer, but instead very carefully came to the rooftop of the small building and quietly hid. And the person responsible for guarding the rooftop didn't notice any sign of Jo-young at all, while at this moment, Jo-young finally saw everything inside clearly. Jane Foster and Professor Shagav, as well as Daisy Lewis, and even including Iron Man Stark and Phil Coulson, were all in the small building below at this time. They were conducting various tests around Thor's hammer. Professor Shagav is an expert in related fields. Even Stark couldn't compare to him in this area. After studying for a long time, Professor Shagav finally said with absolute certainty, "There's no mistake, this is the legendary Thor's hammer. It's just, how did it suddenly appear on Earth?" Phil Coulson, who had been standing by, nodded, then turned to look at Stark, with a hint of inquiry in his eyes. Jarvis compared all the collected information about this type of hammer weapon. The one that best fits the description is also Thor's hammer from Norse mythology. Moreover, 80% of the images passed down from ancient times to the present are very similar to this Thor's hammer, and some of the text descriptions are simply true descriptions of it. Although I don't want to believe it, this is indeed very likely Thor's hammer. Stark couldn't help but let out a long sigh. To be honest, since he announced that he was Iron Man, there have been enough strange things happening on Earth, but now a Thor's hammer has appeared out of nowhere, and there's a very high possibility that it's real. Tony Stark was not like Professor Shagav, whose mind had been clouded. He understood very clearly that there was no such thing as a free lunch in this world. If a Thor's hammer like this suddenly fell to Earth, then what would follow, without a doubt, would be a violent bloody storm. So we must take it away as soon as possible and can't just leave it here. Stark raised his head, looked at Coulson, and asked, "Coulson, does S.H.I.E.L.D. have any plans?" "None." A hint of worry appeared on Coulson's face as he said, "We've tried many methods, but we can't lift it from the ground." "You just tried it too, Tony. This thing simply cannot be moved." Stark had naturally tried to pick up Thor's hammer. However, even when he was wearing the Iron Man armor and his arc reactor, which imitated cosmic cube particles, was fully powered, he still couldn't budge Thor's hammer. This also corroborated the authenticity of Thor's hammer. "We don't have enough manpower now." Stark shook his head and said, "I don't think it will be long before more people come to snatch this Thor's hammer." "Well, you're here now, aren't you?" Coulson appeared unusually relaxed. Although Stark was called over by Professor Shagav, now that he was here, there were probably virtually no people on this Earth who could snatch Thor's hammer from his hands. However, Coulson immediately added, "We have now deleted all relevant information about this place and Thor's hammer from the internet, suppressing the news as much as possible." "You can't suppress it." Stark shook his head with a heavy expression and said, "Those who should know probably already know by now. It's quite possible they've already gathered their forces and are rushing here. And if they come, their strength will definitely not be weak. You should know, not to mention the security guards and thugs hired by large companies, even among the mercenaries in this world, the top 3 mercenary groups each have thousands of elite retired soldiers. In places like Afghanistan, they can even engage in direct combat with the United States military. Their weapons and firepower are not only not weak at all, but even stronger than the United States military's firepower. Don't look at S.H.I.E.L.D. having so many top agents, but their power is too scattered. If someone really comes to kill, Tony Stark might be fine, but this group of S.H.I.E.L.D. people might be completely wiped out. Don't underestimate those mercenaries. As long as someone pays, they can do anything. Don't forget, later Nick Fury hired a group of mercenaries and directly captured a special cruise ship belonging to S.H.I.E.L.D. Although Stark was very confident enough to kill everyone who came, he wasn't entirely sure he could protect this group of SHIELD personnel. Like this, we have now implemented air traffic control. Whether it's planes passing through here or anything else, they must all change their routes. Coulson said while thinking. In addition, we can also implement traffic control starting tomorrow, mobilizing all police in the entire New Mexico to strictly blockade the roads, not allowing anyone to enter or leave here for a short period. You won't be able to seal it off for more than a few days, right? Professor Shigav on the side couldn't help but interject at this moment. He really didn't like some of SHIELD's actions. We'll seal it off for as long as we can, so we still need to find a way to get this Thor's hammer away as soon as possible. Coulson looked at Professor Shigav and said, Doctor, I'll have to trouble you to work hard. Jo-young heard all of their words clearly and could tell that Stark had already sensed something. And don't look at what he just said, which was aimed at things like mercenaries, but none of those people, no matter who came, could take Thor's hammer. What they were truly worried about were the individuals who could take Thor's hammer, such as Magneto, who had just escaped from prison. At some unknown time, cold raindrops began to fall from the sky, landing on Jo-young, who was hidden on the roof of the small building. This kind of scene is very rare in desert areas. Even when Jo-young saw the raindrops falling, he couldn't help but wonder if there was some magical element at play. But he ultimately dismissed the thought, because at this moment, ordinary people wouldn't be able to use magic that could affect an area spanning tens of kilometers without attracting attention. At least not on Earth. And those who could do so wouldn't expend their energy for such a trivial matter. Jo-young wasn't the only one on the roof. On the other side, two SHIELD snipers were monitoring everything within their field of vision, yet they failed to detect Jo-young's presence. For some reason, Jo-young had a strange feeling. He felt that Loki must have already arrived, that he was definitely hidden somewhere, perhaps even having quietly infiltrated the small building. Maybe his hand was already gripping Thor's hammer. Loki's ability to become invisible is quite strong. To be precise, it's not invisibility, but rather illusion. With his illusionary abilities, even if he were standing right in front of you, you wouldn't be able to sense his presence. Odin is the highest god in Asgard, possessing the mighty power of a Skyfather. The next level, Sub-Skyfather, does not exist in Asgard. Following that are the gods of Asgard. Among the gods of Asgard, the one whose strength is second only to Odin is Heimdall, the guardian god. Thor, Loki, and even Queen Frigga, their strength is a level lower, perhaps even more. Among the younger generation, besides Thor and Loki, the most powerful are undoubtedly Sif and the Warriors 3. However, even Sif has only just stepped across the threshold of godhood. And this is because she was already designated as Thor's future wife, the future queen of the gods of Asgard, that Odin granted her divine authority and she became one of the gods of Asgard. As for the Warriors 3, working together, they might be able to fight Sif to a draw, but individually, each of them is at most at the level of a legendary warrior, on par with the legendary mage that Jo-young once was. It's just that Jo-young had only just initially stepped into the realm of a legendary mage, while they had already been in the legendary warrior realm for countless years, having long since honed their skills to the peak level of a legendary warrior. They only needed to obtain divine authority to immediately become gods. And among the Warriors 3, the only one who could ultimately become one of the gods of Asgard is Volstagg, the oldest among them. Jo-young stayed in Jotunheim for over half a century, receiving almost the entire inheritance of the Frost Giants wizards. Of course, the most core part of it is still in the hands of King Laufey of the Frost Giants. Although King Laufey of the Frost Giants appears to be a powerful warrior, Jo-young believes that he is the most powerful wizard of the Frost Giants. Just like Odin, although Odin is the most powerful warrior, the rune magic that Jo-young learned came entirely from him. In this regard, Odin is far stronger than King Laufey of the Frost Giants. Although there is a certain barrier between Asgard's rune magic and the Frost Giants' wizard inheritance, Jo-young discovered after studying for a while that Asgard's rune magic actually encompasses the Frost Giants' sorcery to a certain extent. To be precise, Asgard's rune magic encompasses everything in the entire 9 realms. Asgard's rune magic originated from Odin exchanging one of his eyes for the World Tree, and the entire 9 realms are actually just fruits grown from the World Tree. Saying they share the same root is not an exaggeration at all. Therefore, it is not at all surprising that Jo-young was able to break through the realm of a legendary mage in Jotunheim by absorbing the inheritance of the Frost Giants wizards. Coupled with his excellent talent and the bonus of the special environment of Jotunheim for ice magic, he was ultimately successful. Although after returning to Earth, the strength Jo-young could exert dropped below that of a legendary mage, his essence is still that of a legendary mage. In the wind and rain, Jo-young's figure was almost completely obscured, practically merging with the entire world. The endless wind and rain at this moment seemed to be his mental feelers, reaching every corner of the entire base. There was no Loki. Within the range of everything Jo-young could sense, he did not sense Loki's presence, but he was certain that Loki was indeed on Earth at this moment, and was constantly observing this place, but Jo-young could never pinpoint his exact location. In fact, Jo-young's guess was correct. Loki was indeed in the base at this moment, and he was in the temporary sample small building. In fact, if it weren't for Jo-young's sudden mental scan at this moment, Loki wouldn't have even noticed Jo-young's special existence. Loki's strength is far greater than Jo-young's. In fact, the moment he stepped into this base, almost everything in the base was already within his grasp. Loki, the god of lies and mischief of Asgard, although the name isn't pleasant, he is truly one of the gods of Asgard, and a god with powerful divine power, a powerful divine magician. Although after coming to Earth, due to the special environment of Earth, he cannot fully exert his full strength, he has not fallen below the divine level. The strength he can exert still stands firmly above the divine level, and the same is true for Thor. Therefore, Jo-young's existence also fell into his eyes immediately. It's just that at that time, Loki regarded Jo-young as part of the entire secret base, a member of S.H.I.E.L.D., and did not view him separately, but now it is different. An interesting little toy. Loki finally just sneered dismissively, and then looked at Thor's hammer, the most important object in the center of the entire base. Thor's hammer, Thor's hammer. You know, back in Asgard, Loki was the first to discover Thor's hammer, but in the end, it fell into Thor's hands. In the past 1,000 years, Loki never understood where he lost, but now he knows. Gripping the handle of Thor's hammer with one hand, Loki pulled upward with force. As expected, Thor's hammer remained motionless. All of this should have been within Loki's expectations. He, who had accompanied Thor for over 1,000 years, naturally knew the power of Thor's hammer best. However, even Thor, before obtaining Odin's permission, could not lift Thor's hammer, let alone Loki, whose strength is inferior to Thor's. But at this moment, an endless surge of unwillingness rose in Loki's heart. He was unwilling, he was not reconciled. Why wasn't he Odin's son? Why did Thor's hammer belong to Thor? Why didn't it belong to him? In this instant, Loki subconsciously used all of his divine power, gripping Thor's hammer tightly and pulling upward. In an instant, countless flashes of lightning and thunder directly struck down from the endless void, directly hitting Loki, who was currently holding the handle of Thor's hammer. And at this moment, Loki was also stunned, because with that single pull just now, he had directly lifted Thor's hammer. Although Thor's hammer was only lifted by a mere half a centimeter, this still did not change the fact that he had lifted Thor's hammer. Even though the immense weight caused Thor's hammer to fall back to the ground in an instant, in that moment, Loki had indeed lifted Thor's hammer. Loki, the god of lies and mischief of Asgard, had lifted Thor's hammer. Loki, the god of lies and mischief of Asgard, had gained the right to wield Thor's hammer. Loki, the god of lies and mischief of Asgard, could become the new owner of Thor's hammer. Loki lifted Thor's hammer. Countless bolts of thunder and lightning flashed across the sky, and a string of lightning struck down directly from high altitude. The booming lightning directly shattered the roof of the temporary building and struck Loki, who had just grasped Thor's hammer. Not only that, but throughout the entire base, endless piercing alarms blared frantically, warning all agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. that an intrusion had occurred, and it was of the most severe level. A burnt, acrid smell permeated the entire building, and this smell was actually coming from Loki. To be honest, at any other time, even powerful lightning would not easily strike Loki, but Loki, who had just grasped Thor's hammer, couldn't help but be stunned in place. He had actually lifted Thor's hammer. It must be known that the nature of this is very serious. Odin himself said that only those who are worthy can become the new master of Thor's hammer, and now Loki has lifted Thor's hammer. Although he hasn't been fully recognized by Thor's hammer yet, given time, he can completely control Thor's hammer, which means he can become the new successor of Asgard through legitimate means. Even with his identity as one of the Frost Giants, as Odin's adopted son for over 1,000 years and having gained the recognition of Thor's hammer, no one can question his status as the legitimate heir. To become the new god king of Asgard without resorting to any conspiracies or tricks, such a shock caused even Loki to be momentarily lost in thought, unable to believe it. It was under these circumstances that the lightning, which struck directly towards Thor's hammer, slammed onto Loki, and the burnt smell immediately spread. However, Loki is Loki after all. This blow completely sobered him up. With a flicker of his figure, he had fully recovered. But at this moment, Stark and the members of S.H.I.E.L.D. also reacted. They were originally discussing how to remove Thor's hammer from here, but in the blink of an eye, a figure suddenly appeared before Thor's hammer and lifted it with one hand. Let alone the countless bolts of lightning still falling from the sky above, the piercing alarms from all sides alone were enough to make them terrified. The first to react at this moment was Tony Stark. Without thinking, he raised his left arm, and a laser cannon blasted out. After Stark arrived here, he had been discussing the matter of Thor's hammer with Jane Foster, Dr. Shagway, and Coulson, so he hadn't completely taken off his Iron Man suit, he had only removed his helmet. That's why he was able to react instantly. A new generation of more powerful laser cannons blasted directly towards Loki. However, to Tony Stark's immense surprise, his laser cannon passed directly through the person, not harming him at all. But while Stark was surprised, Loki was equally surprised, because just now, he tried to lift Thor's hammer to block Stark's laser cannon attack, but suddenly found that even with all his might, he could only lift Thor's hammer half a centimeter. After that, Thor's hammer seemed to be held down by a powerful force, unable to move at all. Moreover, Loki was certain that if he let go of Thor's hammer, it would inevitably fall back to the ground, and it would be uncertain whether he could lift it again afterwards. This was like opening a door of hope directly in front of Loki, but this door of hope had only opened a small crack and was about to close. If he didn't continue to support it with force, there was a good chance he might lose the opportunity to obtain Thor's hammer this time. Dodging Stark's attack was a very simple matter. Although Stark was powerful and the laser cannon's attack speed was fast, the action of him raising his arm was already enough time for Loki to dodge his attack. In fact, in Loki's eyes, Stark's strength was only so-so. The Iron Man suit looked very powerful, but frankly speaking, most of his attacks were straightforward. For ordinary enemies, this kind of attack would easily be effective, but for top experts like them, this kind of attack was too easy to predict, and the time it took for him to raise his arm was enough for them to flash away. Stark's laser cannon had just passed through Loki, and immediately after, a sharp arrow shot in directly from outside. Although it passed through Loki's illusion like Stark's laser cannon, at that very instant, the entire long arrow exploded. In the explosion's firelight, the unprepared Loki grunted and was directly blasted into revealing his true form. And with that, countless bullets rained down on Loki like a storm. The agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. immediately locked onto Loki's position and pulled their triggers with all their might without any hesitation. After all, these people are the professionals in dealing with superheroes in this world, especially Phil Coulson. He has a special action team of his own specifically responsible for these matters, and he has been in this line of work for over 20 years. The gun in his hand looked very ordinary, but if you get hit by a shot, you won't die, but you will completely lose all ability to act. However, the attacks that the people from S.H.I.E.L.D. were determined to succeed with, although they all landed accurately on Loki, they all passed through him, not harming him in the slightest, because they were all shooting at Loki's illusion. Loki, the evil god Loki, how could he be so easy to deal with? And before the people from S.H.I.E.L.D. could attack again, Loki, who reappeared next to Thor's hammer, let out a fierce cold snort. Immediately after, an invisible and powerful psychic storm quickly swirled throughout the entire base, inside and out. The agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. in the base fell to the ground one after another. They hadn't even seen a trace of the enemy before they completely lost consciousness. This included Jane Foster, Dr. Shagway, and Daisy. They all fell to the ground. Coulson perhaps had more experience, so one hand was still propped on the table, swaying, trying to raise his gun to aim at Loki. However, for some unknown reason, several figures of Loki appeared in his eyes at once, and he couldn't lock onto which one was the real Loki. And standing beside him, Stark also heard the piercing alarm inside his Iron Man suit. He was also subjected to a strong psychic attack at the same time, but compared to others, his Iron Man suit had an additional psychic protection program. This was something he had only recently developed, because not long ago, Magneto had escaped from the prison that had held him for several years. Since the matter involved mutants and Magneto, the participation of Charles Professor was certainly indispensable. Although Stark was the main funder of the Mutant Academy, he didn't want to have too much contact with Charles Professor, and now that he had to deal with Magneto, it was natural to develop means to deal with Charles Professor along the way, at the very least to prevent Charles Professor from performing psychic intrusion on him. You have to admit, Stark is a genius in many ways. He thoroughly researched electromagnetism and finally built a defensive layer made of electromagnetic particles inside his Iron Man suit, and it was this that blocked Loki's attack just now. This sound resonated in the minds of two people simultaneously. One was Loki, and the other was Joe Young. In the past, Joe Young had wondered what would happen if Stark stood on his opposing side. You have to admit, his Iron Man suit is indeed very powerful, but as Iron Man, Stark has one major weakness, at least at this time: he himself is too weak. Therefore, whether it was using sniping and assassination when he was not wearing the Iron Man suit, or using psychic intrusion to control or defeat him when he was wearing the Iron Man suit, these were all feasible options, but now, it can be seen that Stark is prepared. And in the future, when he develops the nanotech suit and combines it with the Extremis virus, Stark's last weakness will also be completely filled. Right, there's also the Extremis virus. So, is it possible to tamper with something when Stark gets the Extremis virus? Although the Extremis virus was originally developed by him, the Extremis virus ultimately injected into his body does not necessarily have to be the one he developed. Considering that Stark is likely to stand on his opposing side in the future, Joe Young had to take precautions and make arrangements in advance. However, the one who needs to face Stark's extraordinary talent right now is Loki. That's right, Loki's psychic attack just now was indeed unable to concentrate its power because there were many targets, but the fact that Stark could block his psychic attack, even if only a part of it, was enough to make Loki look at him with new eyes. Loki raised his head and looked at Stark. He suddenly raised his left hand, and the light of magic began to flash, but at this moment, a sharp long arrow suddenly shot from a distance, heading directly for Loki's eyes. However, this long arrow exploded in midair. Loki had suffered a loss once, so how could he fall for it a second time? He immediately directed his left hand towards the direction the long arrow came from. No one saw anything, but they heard the sound of a heavy object falling outside. And it was this precious time gained that Stark suddenly rolled over, and then fired several laser cannons towards Loki in quick succession. However, just like before, although Loki appeared to be gripping Thor's hammer tightly with one hand, Stark's attacks always seemed to hit an illusion, passing directly through without any effect. Loki's eyes, which seemed to smile yet not smile, full of banter, made Stark feel extremely uncomfortable, and the most troublesome thing was that neither he nor Jarvis could find a way to counter Loki in a short time. So at this moment, Stark, forced into a corner, had to shout loudly towards a certain direction high above his head, "What are you still hiding for? Hurry up and make a move." Loki and Joe Young both looked in the direction Stark was pointing at the same time, but they saw nothing there. It was empty. Joe Young was somewhat shocked for a moment. Could it be that in this place, besides Loki and Joe Young, there were other third parties lurking in the dark? Who could it be? Was it Ancient One, or Charles Professor, or perhaps other top experts on this earth? However, before Joe Young could figure it out, he suddenly felt a strong sense of malice, and this malice came from Loki, who was holding Thor's hammer in the center of the base. At this moment, Loki had turned his head to look at Joe Young's location. The next moment, Joe Young immediately rolled quickly to the side, and just at this moment, there was a bang sound from where he had been. The wall panel of the simple mobile room where he was hiding suddenly exploded as if it had been hit by an invisible attack. Stark was calling out to him just now. Joe Young understood in an instant. In the moment of crisis just now, Stark unceremoniously exposed Joe Young's hiding place, thereby attracting Loki's attention. However, Stark didn't know that the location he remembered for Joe Young was actually just the location where Joe Young had inadvertently appeared when Loki attacked him earlier, and by the time Loki attacked, Joe Young was no longer in that place, which led to Joe Young's misjudgment. And while Loki was attacking Joe Young, Stark wasn't idle either. He quickly stood up, aimed at Loki's location, and a cross-shaped high-energy laser beam sliced across. Stark understood clearly. Previously, his attacks on Loki's illusions had all been avoided by him. That was because his attack method was incorrect. So now, Stark adopted a flat horizontal cutting method, determined to hit Loki. Although Loki's strength was considerable, he now had an unavoidable weakness. One of his hands was constantly gripping Thor's hammer tightly, not daring to let go in the slightest. It was precisely this that gave Stark an opportunity. Two intersecting high-energy laser beams crossed horizontally towards Loki, who was tightly gripping Thor's hammer. Their height was less than half a centimeter above Thor's hammer. Unless Loki let go of Thor's hammer at this moment and quickly jumped or squatted, he wouldn't be able to avoid the high-energy laser beams' attack. Actually, for Loki to avoid such high-energy laser beams, he didn't necessarily have to jump or squat. Those postures were too unsightly, and he would absolutely not choose them. But regardless, under such an attack, he had to let go of Thor's hammer in his hand, even if only temporarily. Stark could become a top superhero on Earth, standing shoulder to shoulder with Thor, Captain, Carol, and others. His own intelligence was part of it, but most importantly, it was thanks to the nano-Iron Man armor jointly developed by his father Howard Stark in 2 generations, which included the nano-armor with a simulated cosmic cube particle arc reactor. Stark being able to fight Thanos head-on was also thanks to this special set of armor and the arc reactor. Although Stark's nano-armor was still far from being released, and even the related concepts hadn't been conceived, the simulated cosmic cube particle arc reactor was already embedded in his chest at this moment. Therefore, facing Stark's powerful attack, even someone as strong as Loki couldn't ignore it. At this moment, he finally let go of Thor's hammer in his hand. Actually, with Loki's magic strength, facing the current situation, he didn't necessarily have to let go of Thor's hammer to resolve it. It was just that there were some methods, some magic, that he would rather die than use. Especially now, he had just gained the qualification to wield Thor's hammer. Thor's hammer crashed to the ground. The lightning that had been continuously striking from high altitude also suddenly dispersed. Stark's intersecting high-energy laser beams swept across, but besides forcing Loki to put down Thor's hammer in his hand, there was no other effect. However, Stark inside the Iron Man armor couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief, because at this very moment, a large mass of rainwater directly smashed down from the broken roof of the small building. Earlier, when Loki lifted Thor's hammer, lightning from the endless high altitude had already struck down, directly shattering the roof of the small building, opening a skylight on it. As the lightning fell, rainwater also poured in. However, compared to the powerful lightning, the ordinary rainwater had no killing power at all. Although Loki was forced to endure the bombardment of lightning while fighting Stark and the S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel, not a single drop of rainwater landed on him, showing how strong his power was. But at this moment, a large mass of rainwater directly smashed down from the broken roof of the small building. The covered area directly included everything within 3 meters of Thor's hammer. This meant that as long as Loki was within this range, he would definitely be hit by the rainwater. How could Loki be willing to let himself be drenched by rainwater? As one of the gods of Asgard, the god of lies and mischief, being drenched by Earth's rainwater would absolutely be a humiliation for him. So, just 4 meters above Thor's hammer, an invisible barrier suddenly appeared, intending to block all the falling rainwater. If this were just a large mass of ordinary rainwater, Loki's response would have been perfectly fine. However, it just so happened that Jo-young was mixed in with it. Suddenly, a translucent water gun appeared in midair, then directly pierced the invisible barrier. Under an unbelievably powerful force, the invisible barrier shattered with a crash. The huge mass of water directly splashed down near Thor's hammer. At the same time, a figure appeared in the eyes of Stark and Jo-young in an instant. Stark raised a palm, and the laser cannon in his palm instantly shot out. The energy condensed within it was so powerful that even space was momentarily distorted. Loki had long since seen how powerful this wave of attack was. Coupled with Jo-young hiding in the dark, Loki had no choice but to show his real skills at this moment. 2 20-centimeter-long short blades suddenly appeared in Loki's hands. He crossed the 2 blades and fiercely slashed towards the laser cannon in front of him. Then, with a hiss, Loki was pushed back several meters at once. It was this move that directly pushed Loki out of the range of the rainwater. When Stark's next wave of attack arrived, his powerful laser cannon ultimately only shot through an illusion. The real Loki had long since disappeared, nobody knew where. Seeing this situation, Jo-young, who was hidden in the rainwater, felt his chest tighten. Others might not know, but Jo-young was extremely clear about Loki's true identity as a frost giant. The reason his little trick earlier could force Loki's true body to reveal itself was mainly because the rainwater environment was vastly different from the air environment Loki was in before. The slight discomfort caused by this environmental transition ultimately forced Loki to show himself. But their chance was only for a tiny bit of time. Once that time passed, even if Loki was completely within the water flow controlled by Jo-young would find it difficult to force him to show himself again. Although frost giants are best at directly manipulating ice, they are not unfamiliar with water flow. Therefore, as long as Loki reacted, even if he was 10,000 miles deep underwater, as long as he himself was unwilling, no one could force him to appear. Jo-young's neck couldn't help but tighten. He knew that Loki had targeted him at this moment, because it was Jo-young's move just now that allowed Stark to seize the only opportunity. And to avoid similar things happening next, he would definitely quickly eliminate Jo-young. At this moment, Jo-young was forced to display more of his strength. A nearly white oak magic wand appeared in Jo-young's palm, and a golden magic circle suddenly formed. Immediately after, the surrounding water flow began to rapidly spin continuously, centered around Thor's hammer. At the same time, the raindrops falling from high altitude seemed to be attracted by a mysterious force, pouring into the building like a swarm from the opening in the building's roof, surging into the rapidly spinning vortex centered around Thor's hammer. And if you looked closely, you would find that the undercurrents within the vortex had, at some point, formed extremely transparent water blades, one after another, which began to rapidly rotate around Thor's hammer along with the entire vortex. And at this moment, Iron Man Stark already understood Jo-young's plan. The center of the vortex was the closest place to Thor's hammer, but there was only one passage there. And it was precisely that single passage that, if Loki went to retrieve Thor's hammer at this moment, Stark would surely seize the opportunity to attack him. This was their rare second chance. However, the gap between the two of them and Loki was simply too great. Although both possessed quite outstanding strength, their personal experience and awareness couldn't keep up. While they could cause Loki some trouble in a short time, they were fundamentally unable to harm him. "Caught you," a voice suddenly rang out in the water flow. Immediately after, Jo-young was violently smashed away by a powerful force, heavily hitting the stone pillar below Thor's hammer. Under the huge impact force, Jo-young couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of fresh blood. The spurting blood splashed onto the stone pillar below, and at the same time, it also splashed onto Thor's hammer above. What blood recognition? Wake up, buddy, that's just a plot from novels, it's impossible to happen in reality. So Jo-young didn't care about his blood dripping onto Thor's hammer at all. If that method really worked, then Loki would have used it long ago, and it wouldn't be Jo-young's turn. Moreover, over countless years, Thor didn't know how many people he had killed while holding Thor's hammer. If dripping blood was truly effective, then Thor's hammer would have fallen into someone else's hands long ago, so how could it appear before Jo-young today? However, when Jo-young's blood dripped onto Thor's hammer, it angered the hidden Loki, because in his opinion, Jo-young's blood had defiled Thor's hammer, and he needed to pay the price with his life. "You deserve to die." Under the flickering lights, accompanied by an angry roar, a figure arrived before Jo-young in the blink of an eye, a sharp short sword in his hand thrusting directly at Jo-young's heart. All of this happened extremely fast. Loki's movement speed was even faster than Jo-young's reaction speed. If he were truly stabbed by this sword, let alone Jo-young, even if an immortal came, it would be useless, he would be dead. At this moment, Stark was already struggling to lock onto Loki's position. This guy's whereabouts were always so elusive, as if he was in another space. Stark and Jo-young used every means possible, but could only force Loki to show himself once. The gap in their strength was truly significant. In fact, many people have intentionally or unintentionally overlooked the powerful strength that Loki possesses. As one of the gods of Asgard, a powerful god-level magician, Loki commands strange magic that countless people can't even imagine, and he possesses an immensely vast magical power. Thousands of years of combat have honed his experience and vision, and his extremely deep understanding of the entire universe has made his own strength terrifyingly powerful. Otherwise, how would Loki dare to contend for the position of God King of Asgard with Thor, who possesses Thor's hammer? You should know that to become the God King of Asgard, putting everything else aside, one must at least possess the strength to awe the entire 9 realms. Especially compared to Jo-young, Loki's magical abilities inherited traditions from both the Aesir and Vanir, while what Jo-young learned was merely a part of the Aesir rune magic. Therefore, no matter what methods he used, he was actually within Loki's control. Loki could easily discover him, and he could just as easily shatter all of his magic and easily take his life. Seeing Loki's sharp short sword already piercing Jo-young's skin, just a few inches away from piercing his heart and directly taking his life. But at this moment, suddenly, a blinding bolt of lightning abruptly fell from the sky, instantly landing before Loki, then directly striking Jo-young's body, and then through the short sword that had already pierced Jo-young's skin, it surged onto Loki's body. This force was extremely powerful. If Loki used his full strength, he could completely and easily block this lightning attack. However, the huge practical gap between him and Jo-young meant he didn't use more than half his strength when killing Jo-young. So when this lightning struck, Loki had to evading the lightning while also evading Stark. Stark had been trying to lock onto Loki all along, and if Loki fully endured the lightning attack at this moment, then afterwards, he would inevitably find it difficult to escape Stark's lock. Perhaps Stark was far inferior to Loki in combat level, but Stark's attack capabilities should not be underestimated. Loki merely hesitated and retreated a step, but it was just this step, and more, arguably endless, lightning bolts struck directly from high above, directly hitting Jo-young's body, and then surging outwards in all directions. And all of this, Loki finally revealed himself amidst the endless lightning, not because of the lightning's attack, but because of his own surprise. This scene before him was not unfamiliar to Loki, because in countless years past, when Loki and Thor fought side by side, he had seen similar scenes. Thor stood there, wielding Thor's hammer, while endless lightning struck down from high above, guided by Thor's hammer, directly striking Thor's enemies. And now, it was as if the person standing opposite Thor's hammer was him. Someone has gained control of Thor's hammer. This thought flashed through Loki's mind in an instant, and there was undoubtedly only one person before him. Loki's figure was instantly shattered directly. The attackers were not only Stark's palm cannons, but also the endless lightning. Lightning raged in every inch of every corner throughout the small building, but it very coincidentally avoided everyone lying on the ground inside the small building, including Stark standing there, yet Loki's whereabouts were nowhere to be seen. Loki was too familiar with Thor's hammer. Its power had only just begun to manifest, and he had already quickly avoided the range of power Thor's hammer unleashed. And neither Stark's palm cannons nor the powerful lightning could ultimately do anything to Loki. The endless lightning quickly coiled back, ultimately retracting directly into a hammer held high, and this divine hammer inscribed with countless runes was none other than Thor's hammer, and now, the person holding it was Jo-young. However, at this moment, there was no hint of joy on Jo-young's face. His expression was exceptionally solemn, exceptionally complex, completely lacking the ease of having solved someone else's problem. And in Stark's view at this moment, Jo-young holding Thor's hammer was the greatest miracle. It was precisely because Jo-young now controlled Thor's hammer that they were able to survive under Loki's hand, and this involved not just the two of them, but also the countless S.H.I.E.L.D. agents around. However, for Jo-young, it actually had no meaning at all, because he had now re-entered the legendary realm. After gaining control of Thor's hammer, he returned to the legendary realm, and on Earth at that, and with Thor's hammer, he could even unleash attacks of god-level power. However, all of this was not what Jo-young wanted. That's right, he did want to regain the strength of a legendary mage on Earth as quickly as possible, but not through this method. This method had two great hidden dangers. Thor's hammer belongs to Thor. By taking Thor's hammer, Jo-young was essentially standing against Thor, not to mention Loki who wanted to seize Thor's hammer. Perhaps on Earth, he could barely protect his life, but from now on, no matter what he did, he would be watched and monitored by countless people. The most crucial point was that this path was not what Jo-young wanted. When Jo-young was in Jotunheim, he broke through to the realm of a legendary mage by relying on ice magic. After returning to Earth, he did not want to follow this path because he knew that everything was arranged by Odin, and to break free from Odin's arrangements, he had to take a path that Odin could not imagine. What he chose was the spatial power of the cosmic cube, which is why he tried every means to obtain the elemental structure of the imitation cosmic cube particles that Stark was building. However, just now, when he was facing Loki's powerful threat, he suddenly felt an inexplicable connection appear between him and Thor's hammer. Somehow, Thor's hammer fell into his hands, and a powerful burst of lightning power instantly forced Loki to retreat. And it was during this process that the endless lightning surged into Zhou Yang's body, merged into his sea of spiritual power, merged into his sea of magical power, and finally forcefully pushed him into the realm of a legendary magician. At the same time, it also destroyed the foundation of his ice elemental legendary power. Zhou Yang had a faint feeling that this was another arrangement by Odin. But why? This trial was clearly aimed at Thor, so why not let Thor pick up Thor's hammer and directly defeat his brother Loki? Instead, why involve Zhou Yang and let him get Thor's hammer? What exactly is going on? Zhou Yang didn't understand why he got Thor's hammer, and Loki didn't understand either. On the desert of New Mexico, the cold wind and heavy rain were still beating down on the ground, and the rain was getting heavier. Loki was hiding on the hillside outside the base, his eyes fixed on Zhou Yang, who was standing there holding Thor's hammer. His face was ashen. What happened today was too unexpected. Not only did he himself lift Thor's hammer, but someone even went a step further than him and completely controlled Thor's hammer. What is going on? Has All-Father Odin completely lost control of Thor's hammer? Otherwise there wouldn't be so many people qualified to obtain it. Loki himself, plus Zhou Yang, and a very certain Thor, and perhaps many others. What is wrong with this world? It's so chaotic. Also, where is Thor now? Where did he go? And this person in front of him, what makes him qualified to obtain Thor's hammer? Loki had a very bad guess in his mind at this moment, but he didn't dare to be completely sure. In the dark, rainy night, the look on Loki's face was uncertain. Even he, having lived for 1500 years, had never encountered such a thing. But no matter what, he had to try again, because tonight was the best time for him to obtain Thor's hammer. The next moment, with a flash of movement, Loki had disappeared from the hillside. And at this moment, inside the base, the only two people who were awake had been on alert for a long time. After Loki didn't show up for a long time, Stark finally couldn't help but speak. "Hello, Mr. Daniel Joe." Hearing Stark call out his name, Zhou Yang wasn't surprised. After all, they had already met before the Stark Expo. Stark had, of course, obtained information about Zhou Yang from Nick Fury, but that wasn't important. Stark then asked, "Did you come here for this hammer?" Zhou Yang raised an eyebrow. Stark's words had an underlying meaning. However, he didn't need to lie anymore at this point. Half the reason is this hammer. After all, we rune magicians inherited from Norse mythology, and this Thor's hammer is the weapon of Thor, one of the Norse gods. So when I heard the relevant news, I naturally had to rush over to take a look. Looking at Stark's unmoved expression, Zhou Yang immediately understood that what he had revealed on the surface had probably already been thoroughly investigated by Nick Fury. If he hadn't secretly released some special things, causing some people within S.H.I.E.L.D. to help cover it up, otherwise, a further investigation would likely uncover more of his background. After all, Zhou Yang had clashed with Nick Fury during World War II, although only once. But if Nick Fury were to connect him with his identity at that time, haha, it would be lively. However, things weren't that bad. After all, Zhou Yang's appearance had changed drastically since then. Although there were still some shadows of the past, he now looked more like his appearance in his previous life, and his name was a Chinese name. Unless those who had deep interactions with him back then reappeared, even if someone told them who he was, it would probably be hard to believe. So, facing Stark, who already had a good understanding of him, Zhou Yang followed up by saying, "I never thought I could lift this hammer. After all, it is the weapon of Thor. I only wanted to get some information about rune magic from this hammer, but now, somehow, I actually lifted it, and..." Before Zhou Yang finished speaking, the Thor's hammer in his hand had already been thrown violently towards the diagonal front. Thor's hammer instantly left his hand and smashed fiercely towards a certain point in the void inside the small building. And where there should have been no one, two short swords suddenly crossed side by side, and then collided fiercely with Thor's hammer. Loki was instantly revealed when he was hit. Under the powerful force, he was smashed hard against the wall, creating a large hole in it, and then fell heavily onto the ground outside, disappearing instantly afterward. Stark was also completely on guard at this moment. In a place where Zhou Yang couldn't hear, Stark quickly shouted to Jarvis, "Quick, Jarvis, turn on holographic search mode, collect all information about that person in all directions." Stark might not be able to decipher Loki's magic, but he could find ways to grasp all the patterns of Loki's invisibility and appearance, capture the external information reflecting these patterns, and thus accurately determine Loki's location. Perhaps most of the credit here should go to Jarvis, but no one can deny Stark's genius. If he hadn't clearly seen through this point, then they might always be in a passive position when facing Loki in the future. However, Loki was not that easy to deal with. After Thor's hammer flew back into Zhou Yang's hand, Loki suddenly appeared behind Zhou Yang. Zhou Yang quickly turned around and swung the hammer. The speed was astonishing, and the hammer directly hit Loki. However, the next moment, Zhou Yang's hammer hit nothing. What appeared behind Zhou Yang was just a phantom of Loki. Zhou Yang was also skilled in this area. Without thinking, Thor's hammer flew out of his hand and began to spin rapidly around him in the blink of an eye. And with a bang, Loki, who was waiting for an opportunity to attack from behind Zhou Yang, was repelled. At the same time, the dark clouds above once again struck down countless bolts of lightning. Centered around Thor's hammer, the lightning began to spread rapidly around Zhou Yang's body. The next moment, in the endless net of lightning, Loki's figure was forced to appear. But immediately after, more than a dozen figures of Loki appeared in the net of lightning in an instant. They were almost shoulder to shoulder, holding short swords in the net of lightning, stabbing towards Zhou Yang, who was at the very center. The range of Thor's hammer's rotation suddenly expanded, and in an instant, it knocked over all the dozen or so figures of Loki. However, they immediately turned into foam, because they were all phantoms of Loki. Careful, Stark's urgent warning came, and at the same time, the repulsor ray in his hand suddenly fired. But at this moment, Loki had already appeared above Zhou Yang's head. Enduring countless bolts of lightning and thunder, he held a long sword and directly stabbed towards the top of Zhou Yang's head. It was also because Zhou Yang couldn't unleash the full power of Thor's hammer at the moment, coupled with Loki's familiarity with Thor's hammer, that he was able to so easily endure the endless thunder and lightning and directly assassinate Zhou Yang. However, Zhou Yang was not that easy to provoke. Loki's sword stabbed down, directly penetrating Zhou Yang's head, and his arm also penetrated deeply. Incorrect. Loki sensed the problem in the first instant. He suddenly landed, narrowly avoiding Stark's attack, but at this moment, Zhou Yang, who had been standing there, had already disappeared. That figure just now was merely an illusion cast by Zhou Yang. Even someone as powerful as Loki fell for it when he wasn't careful. In reality, under normal circumstances, Zhou Yang's level of illusion would never be able to deceive Loki. It was only because Loki's mental sensing ability was greatly interfered with in the environment of endless lightning that it gave Zhou Yang an opportunity. However, Zhou Yang had finally managed to lure Loki in, so how could it end so easily? At this instant, all the spread out lightning suddenly retracted, instantly rolling inward towards the most important target, Loki. And the constantly rotating Thor's hammer suddenly flew upwards, instantly attracting more thunder and lightning to descend from the sky, and then in an instant, all the lightning struck Loki in the very center. Then, there was no then. Loki turned into a phantom at the last moment and disappeared from the spot. In an instant, Zhou Yang felt a chill all over. A sharp short sword had already slipped into his palm. At the same time, Thor's hammer also flew back instantly and began to spin rapidly around him. Up and down, round and round, it spun non-stop, doing everything possible to guard against Loki's possible sneak attack. Stark on the side was also the same, the repulsor rays in both his hands were ready to fire at any time. At the same time, Jarvis was also conducting a rapid search in the surrounding area, attempting to find Loki's whereabouts in the shortest possible time. However, their defense lasted until someone from S.H.I.E.L.D. woke up. Loki did not reappear, which was considered a temporary end to the situation. And the first person from S.H.I.E.L.D. to wake up was none other than Hawkeye Barton. And unknowingly, a long time had passed. By this time, Stark and Zhou Yang exchanged glances and confirmed that Loki had completely left. Only then did the two of them let out a long sigh of relief. The people from S.H.I.E.L.D. woke up one after another, but there were also a few who had fallen asleep forever. A clean conference room was simply tidied up. Coulson, sitting on the other side of the table, watched Zhou Yang wield Thor's hammer flying up and down, feeling quite unhappy. How did the United States military end up getting Thor's hammer? At first, the people from S.H.I.E.L.D. didn't recognize Zhou Yang. Hawkeye Barton even shot an arrow at him at first, but that arrow was completely blocked by Thor's hammer, and Stark also began to introduce Zhou Yang's identity to Coulson. Coulson's position in S.H.I.E.L.D. was indeed not low, but no more than 5 people in the entire S.H.I.E.L.D. truly knew Zhou Yang's identity, and Coulson was not among them. At this time, besides Coulson and Stark, there were no other people sitting in the conference room. The information about Zhou Yang was highly confidential, and even Hawkeye Barton did not have the right to know more information. After a slight cough, Coulson then spoke, "Mr. Zhou, I would like to know how you plan to handle this Thor's hammer next." Hearing Coulson's question, Zhou Yang reached out and took Thor's hammer back into his hand, then gently placed it on the desk. Finally, he sat opposite Coulson and looked at him calmly, saying, "No, you are wrong. This is not Thor's hammer. At most, this is just a replica of Thor's hammer. The real Thor's hammer is still in Thor's hand." Zhou Yang's words stunned both Coulson and Stark. They had been fighting tooth and nail over Thor's hammer just now, and now he was telling them that this wasn't the real Thor's hammer. Who would believe that? Seeing the expressions on their faces, Zhou Yang couldn't help but laugh. Thor's hammer is only the real Thor's hammer in the hands of Thor. So no matter whose hands it is in, it's just a very similar replica. Stark blinked, and suddenly his eyes widened. It was clear that he had understood the meaning of Zhou Yang's words. As for Coulson, although Coulson was an expert in action, his awareness in political matters was still a bit lower. Chapter 71. This isn't the real Thor's hammer. Professor Eric Selvig looked at the powerful artifact that Zhou Yang had placed on the table, put down the book he had found from who knows where, and looked at Zhou Yang and Stark with disbelief. In fact, besides Zhou Yang and Stark, everyone else also didn't believe what Zhou Yang said. If that wasn't Thor's hammer, then how could it possess such powerful strength? Also, if that wasn't Thor's hammer, then why did so many of you come here to seize it? Regarding everyone's questions, Zhou Yang just smiled lightly. If it were truly Thor's hammer, then why would it be in my possession, and I'm not the only one who can wield it? Although everyone except Zhou Yang and Stark had fainted during Loki's previous attack, the internal and external surveillance here was still operating normally, and most of their fight with Loki was captured. Zhou Yang's words made everyone fall silent, and they couldn't help but look at Thor's hammer. Since both Zhou Yang and Loki could lift Thor's hammer, it wasn't impossible for the others to have that possibility as well. So who was the person who came out to seize Thor's hammer? Coulson finally asked what he wanted to know the most. This matter was truly messed up. Loki was the strongest, and it was understandable that he could sneak into the secret base undetected, but why couldn't they even detect Zhou Yang when he was lurking in the dark? On top of that, several agents died, so there would be plenty of reports to write when they got back. He's not from Earth, anyway. Even the most powerful sorcerer on Earth isn't as formidable as him. Zhou Yang was actually right about this. If only considering magical strength, even Ancient One and Merlin wouldn't be a match for Loki. After all, Loki is one of the gods of Asgard, a powerful divine sorcerer. Ancient One and Merlin, one relied on Dormammu's magic and the Time Stone, while the other relied on the power of the Celtic gods. Zhou Yang reached out and touched the handle of Thor's hammer, saying with a half-smile, perhaps he and it came from the same place. Thor's hammer was not a creation of Earth. Dr. Shagway and Stark had already reached this consensus before Loki arrived. As for these matters, Coulson and the rest of the S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel just stood aside and listened quietly, not participating in the discussion. It was the same now. These highly specialized items still needed to be judged by the experts. Furthermore, Coulson was actually no stranger to the matter of aliens. He had personally participated in the related incident involving Captain Marvel Carol back then. If this hammer is truly Thor's hammer, then that person is very likely his brother Loki, but if this hammer is not Thor's hammer, then that person's identity is very difficult to determine. When Professor Shagav said this, his gaze was fixed on Zhou Yang. Zhou Yang, on the other hand, had an expressionless face. Regarding whether this hammer was truly not Thor's hammer, although he said so, if he had to be 100% certain, he might say that to others, but he still had to be honest with himself. If things developed according to the normal timeline, this hammer here would definitely be Thor's hammer, and that person would undoubtedly be Loki, which would mean that Thor would definitely be around it, as he is the true thunder god. However, the problem lay here. Thor was missing, or rather, he hadn't appeared from the beginning. As for this hammer, not only did Loki lift it, but Zhou Yang was further gaining control of it. Could Thor's hammer, which Zhou Yang could control, still be Thor's hammer? Also, where was Thor now? Did he also have a Thor's hammer in his hand? If Thor also had a Thor's hammer in his hand, then this current Thor's hammer must be fake. But if this Thor's hammer was fake, then why would Loki, who had been with Thor for over 1,000 years, mistake it? At this moment, Stark said indifferently, whether this hammer is Thor's hammer or not, just treat it as Thor's hammer. As for that person, he's so difficult to deal with, does it make a difference if he's Loki? Hearing Stark say this, Jo Young and Professor Shagav were slightly taken aback at the same time, and then both fell silent. Indeed, that was the logic. Loki was so powerful, no matter how they speculated about his identity, his strength was still a chasm they couldn't cross. This time, if Jo Young hadn't suddenly gained control of Thor's hammer, they might have already been completely wiped out. After a moment of silence, Coulson suddenly spoke up and asked Jo Young, "Mr. Jo, what do you plan to do next?" Next, Jo Young raised an eyebrow when he heard Coulson say this and said, "What, does S.H.I.E.L.D. have other ideas?" Coulson nodded and then said very directly, "This Thor's hammer, let's just call it Thor's hammer for now. Its power is so great that we hope to put it in a safer place to prevent it from falling into the hands of Loki." Regardless of whether it was in myths and legends or the fact that he had caused the deaths of several agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. earlier, Loki was categorized as a wicked god. Hearing Coulson say this, Jo Young smiled faintly. He let go of Thor's hammer in his hand and stepped back 2 steps, saying, "Please, as long as you can lift it, feel free to take it anywhere you want. S.H.I.E.L.D. just wants to take Thor's hammer for themselves, right? Fine, feel free, as long as you can take it." The thought of letting them take Thor's hammer made a surge of anger rise in Coulson's heart. If they had really had a way to take Thor's hammer before, it would have been taken long ago. How could Jo Young have gotten the advantage later? However, at this moment, Jo Young's attitude was very clear, he would not help them. So, at this moment, Coulson couldn't help but look at Tony Stark and pleaded, "Mr. Stark." Stark turned his head to look at Jo Young, while Jo Young just smiled easily and made a gesture of invitation. To be honest, Jo Young also wanted to see who else besides himself could lift Thor's hammer. To break the deadlock in this situation, they only needed a powerful figure, and Tony Stark was definitely a favorable candidate. Seeing Jo Young's indifferent look, Stark didn't think any further, stepped forward 2 steps, and grabbed the handle of Thor's hammer. However, the next moment, even with the arc reactor at full power, Stark strained to lift Thor's hammer, like trying to kick a mountain. There was absolutely no effect. Thor's hammer remained motionless, as if it were made of iron stuck to the table. In fact, with Stark's strength, that attempt should have even flipped the table, but there was indeed no effect. At this moment, Coulson looked sheepishly at Jo Young, but then he noticed Jo Young's pensive expression. "Can I try? Maybe I'll have a chance." Daisy Louise suddenly spoke up at this moment, raising her hand. Jo Young was startled awake and couldn't help but laugh, seeing the voluptuous Daisy looking so adorably silly. "Sure, feel free to try." Jo Young finished speaking and then looked at Coulson. "Agent Coulson, there are still many agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. in the entire base. You can have them all try it. As long as they can take it, I won't say another word." Jo Young's expression was very serious, which made Coulson unable to refuse. Following that, Jo Young continued, "However, I must remind you that you don't have much time left. In about half an hour, the United States military should have arrived." The United States military, Coulson couldn't help but exclaim. Only then did he remember the military ID Jo Young had shown him earlier. Although they all knew that military ID was fake, Daniel Whitehouse was indeed a genuinely registered active duty major in the United States military, directly commanded by the White House and the Department of Defense. "You contacted the United States military?" Stark looked at Jo Young with some surprise. He wasn't too averse to the arrival of the United States military. Although some people had tried to seize his Iron Man armor before, those were actually some people from the Senate and House of Representatives. The United States military hadn't taken action, and Colonel Rhodes had always been helping him. Furthermore, Stark Industries had always been the largest weapons contractor for the United States military, and he had good relationships with the high-ranking officers in the United States military. Jo Young nodded and said in front of Coulson, "I don't really like S.H.I.E.L.D.'s way of doing things. They want to monopolize things but lack the ability to protect them. They are actually not as good as the United States military. At the very least, their firepower deterrence is strong enough. Indeed, with Loki's strength, even detonating a nuclear bomb in his face might not kill him, but it would be enough to severely injure him. Moreover, no matter how powerful a strong individual is, when facing a nuclear bomb, they are more likely to escape the core area of the nuclear explosion before the full power of the nuclear bomb erupts, so that they can survive in the peripheral area of the nuclear explosion. Few people can completely withstand the power of a direct nuclear explosion. It's just that they have enough ability to escape before the power of the nuclear bomb explodes. Moreover, the United States military's weapons are far more powerful than SHIELD's weapons. Even if it's just a false sense of security, it's enough to reassure Jo Young. And the most crucial thing is that the people in the United States military are obedient enough. After all, Jo Young directly contacted General Ross, and General Ross contacted the White House. Looking at Coulson, who had already started calling Nick Fury, Stark couldn't help but ask Jo Young, "Where do you plan to take this hammer?" "To a secret base of the United States military." "No, I'm not going anywhere. I plan to stay right here." Jo Young looked at Stark and said with a slight worry, "You don't think that guy will just give up, do you?" Would Loki give up on Thor's hammer? Jo Young absolutely didn't believe that. Given even a slight chance, Loki would definitely seize Thor's hammer. However, at this moment, just like before, the reason Loki suddenly disappeared was partly because Jo Young was difficult to deal with, and partly because he himself was actually doubting whether the Thor's hammer in Jo Young's hand was real. Thor being banished to Earth by Odin was actually just a setup. The targets of this setup included not only Loki but also the frost giants of Jotunheim. Because Jo Young knew that after this incident, the entire frost giant race of Jotunheim would be almost wiped out, and Loki would also be driven out of Asgard. It seemed like a perfect happy ending, but all the potential threats related to Loki were removed. Odin played a good hand. But now, the direction of the situation was vastly different from what Jo Young originally knew. Thor was still nowhere to be seen, which made Jo Young feel a bit uneasy. What was that guy Odin up to again? Before Odin died, even though he was exceptionally weak, the 9 realms were still under his control. Even the Dark Elves, who later rose again with the Ether, were ultimately destroyed. It could be said that he eliminated all internal threats within the 9 realms for Thor, let alone Earth. Jo Young didn't have enough information yet to make too many judgments, but he firmly believed in one thing. As long as he held this Thor's hammer in his hand, whether it was real or fake, Thor would show up one day. New York, Dr. Donald Blake, who had just returned from a trip to Norway, returned to his clinic. Jo Young didn't know how Nick Fury had negotiated with Deputy Director Ross, but in the end, the people from S.H.I.E.L.D. stayed, the people from the United States military also stayed, and everyone worked together to build a stronger base. The person sent by the United States military was Colonel Kane, a direct subordinate of Deputy Director Ross from his time in the military. Although Deputy Director Ross had retired from the military to pursue politics, he still maintained significant influence within the United States military. Of course, the final approval for this matter came from the White House, as it involved a real and powerful mythological civilization. Although S.H.I.E.L.D. is backed by the World Security Council, don't forget that within the World Security Council, America has the strongest voice, and receives the most annual funding. Not to mention their headquarters are in America, and most of the agents are American. Even the branches in other parts of the world combined do not outnumber the branches located in America. Frankly speaking, S.H.I.E.L.D. is essentially a strong arm of America. Although the World Security Council has 5 major members, Britain and France are already aligned with America. When issues arise, they can immediately form an absolute majority of votes, thus facilitating policies and actions favorable to America. It was only after Nick Fury became the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. that S.H.I.E.L.D. gradually began to break free from America's control, which is why the relationship between the two sides is no longer as close. However, since Nick Fury is someone who can directly communicate with the White House, it was not surprising that this agreement was ultimately reached. Jo Young had no objections to S.H.I.E.L.D. staying. Anyway, if Loki really attacked again and S.H.I.E.L.D. suffered more casualties, they would bear the responsibility themselves. In fact, many people had asked Jo Young why he refused to leave New Mexico, but Jo Young was very direct. Facing an opponent similar to Loki, no place in this world was safe. No matter how many people there were or how strong the fortress was, it was useless. He could appear silently by your side at any time, anywhere. So, returning to any secret base or a large city like New York or Washington would not only be useless but would also cause unnecessary casualties. The United States military personnel didn't have much reaction to Zhou Yang's words. After all, they didn't participate in that battle, and they only followed orders. The White House told them to be stationed in New Mexico, so they were stationed in New Mexico. Anyway, the nearest town was only 60 miles away, and everything they needed could be transported quickly. It was the SHIELD personnel, especially Coulson, who had a different reaction. Compared to the others, he at least caught a glimpse of Loki, while the others had already fainted before even seeing Loki. After hearing Zhou Yang and Mr. Stark describe their encounter with Loki, one question remained unanswered to this day. How did Loki escape so suddenly at the end, and why did he escape? Although Zhou Yang's plan could indeed severely disadvantage Loki, if he had truly pushed forward forcefully, Zhou Yang and Mr. Stark might not have been able to stop him. But under these circumstances, Loki suddenly and inexplicably disappeared, and he still hasn't returned to kill them so far. So, whether he will return to kill them in the future, and by what means he will return, are all questions that must be seriously considered. How to prevent Loki from infiltrating silently like before? To solve this problem, Mr. Stark also stayed. He and Professor Shigav are working together to tackle this difficult problem. Jane Foster also stayed. If that person was truly Loki, the trickster god from Norse mythology, then his environment, the surrounding star arrangements, and how he came to Earth, all deeply fascinated Jane Foster. Jane Foster stayed, and Daisy Louise also stayed, although she primarily did some odd jobs to help out. Zhou Yang did not touch Thor's hammer again. The power of Thor's hammer had directly allowed him to break through to the realm of a legendary mage. However, he could not fully control this power. He could only unleash it all at once when using it, but precise manipulation was difficult. This requires a long period of training and accumulation, which cannot be achieved in a short time. Moreover, what Zhou Yang was most worried about was what was behind this. Odin would not give him Thor's hammer for no reason, let alone the power of Thor's hammer, and this power made Zhou Yang's heart pound even more. Recalling how Thor, the thunder god who once possessed this power, had all his divine power stripped away by Odin with surprising ease, did this also mean that this power could be stripped away by Odin at any time in the future, or even that Odin could control Zhou Yang through this power? The Infinity Stones must be found in the shortest possible time. This is the only way Zhou Yang can escape his current predicament. Regarding Thor's hammer, Zhou Yang had left it on the table. Although Zhou Yang said that Coulson could have anyone take it away casually that day, Coulson did not do so, because if it were truly that easy to take Thor's hammer, they wouldn't have been so helpless before. And in fact, if you think about it carefully, both Loki and Zhou Yang possess extremely strong abilities, while none of the agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. possess such abilities. And the only one with comparable ability, Mr. Stark, cannot move Thor's hammer. The sky grew dark again, and the stars above were extraordinarily bright. In America, perhaps only in the New Mexico desert could such a beautiful sight be seen. Over there, Mr. Stark and Dr. Shagway were still arguing, while Jane Foster and Daisy Louise were studying astronomical data. In fact, many people misunderstood Daisy Louise. Although she wasn't in a related major, being able to get into Imperial University meant she was a top student. She was quite inconspicuous in high school and only gradually shone in college. Unfortunately, the only boyfriend she had in college broke up with her half a month after she left New York and came to New Mexico. She and Jane Foster had been out for over half a year on this trip, and they had stayed in New Mexico for over 3 months alone. Zhou Yang did not reveal his true identity. After all, he was currently presenting himself as Daniel Whitehouse, an active American military officer, so how could he be a freshman at Imperial University? Although Mr. Stark and the others had already blurted out Zhou Yang's name, Daniel Zhou could also be a middle name. Everyone understood many things in their hearts, but they couldn't bring them out into the open. However, it would be a different matter when Zhou Yang and Daisy Louise met in New York in the future. Just then, the phone suddenly rang, interrupting Zhou Yang's thoughts. He turned to look at Jane Foster, who was making the sound. Seeing everyone instinctively look over, Jane Foster glanced at the incoming call, then hung up directly, explaining to the others, "I'm sorry, I interrupted everyone." "No need to apologize, there's no progress anyway." Zhou Yang glanced at everyone present with a hint of mockery, then asked Jane Foster, Dr. Foster, if you have other things to handle, you can go ahead. Don't mind him, my ex-boyfriend, Dr. Donald Blake. Jane Foster waved her hand. Just then, there was a ding sound, and a message came through. Jane Foster glanced at it, chuckled self-deprecatingly, and said, "He asked me to find time to go back and move my things out of the apartment." Jane Foster's place in New York was an apartment rented by her boyfriend. Now that they had broken up, she naturally had to take her things. The reason for their breakup was that Jane Foster often went out into the field to collect data. Sometimes she was in Iceland, sometimes in the Arctic in Canada, and now she was in New Mexico. Being separated for a long time, breaking up was inevitable. "What did you say? His name is Dr. Donald Blake." Jo Young couldn't help but reach out and interrupt Jane Foster's words. Seeing her nod, Jo Young couldn't help but let out a relaxed laugh. The heavy stone in his heart finally fell. "What, you know him?" Jane Foster looked at Jo Young with a slightly strange expression and couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Of course, Jo Young couldn't say he didn't know him in response to Jane Foster's question. If he didn't know him, his previous surprised expression would be suspicious, so he simply nodded and said, "I've been to his clinic and seen him a few times occasionally." So that's how it is. Although Jane Foster had mostly put down her suspicion, she still couldn't quite believe that someone she had just met happened to be a former patient of her ex-boyfriend. However, there wasn't much to be suspicious about. Dr. Donald Blake graduated from Harvard Medical School and is an excellent surgeon. He even has his own private clinic in New York, and when they were together, Jane Foster often helped out at the clinic. In fact, for a high-achieving graduate like Dr. Donald Blake from Harvard Medical School, the first choice after graduation would usually be large hospitals. However, the reason he chose to open his own private clinic was because he had a disability in one foot. Of course, Jo Young didn't know such detailed circumstances, but he knew that a person named Dr. Donald Blake existed in this world, and that was enough. All the dark clouds that had been surrounding him and Thor's hammer were completely dispelled at this moment. Although the world Jo Young was currently in was already somewhat different from the MCU, the general outline was still connected within the entire Marvel world dimension. Perhaps everything should have been this way, or perhaps something went wrong in the middle, but no matter what, it was finally reassuring. Jo Young said seemingly casually, "Dr. Foster, if the research here doesn't yield results for a long time, I suggest you find a place to relax and deal with your affairs in New York. That's also a viable option." After speaking, Jo Young smiled mysteriously at everyone. The next moment, he reached out his hand, and Thor's hammer, which had been placed on the table, flew directly into his palm. Immediately after, Jo Young swung hard, and Thor's hammer carried him directly into the sky, disappearing in the blink of an eye. "Wow," Daisy Louise couldn't help but exclaim in surprise, then turned to Jane Foster and said, "He's not going to take that hammer and leave, never to return, is he?" However, before Jane Foster could speak, Coulson quickly said, "Mr. Stark, could you please follow him and take a look, just in case something happens?" Mr. Stark glared at Coulson in annoyance. If he really wanted to leave, he would have left already. Despite his dissatisfaction with Coulson's suspicion, Mr. Stark immediately put on his Iron Man armor, and hot, dazzling flames shot out. In an instant, the Iron Man armor was closely tracking Jo Young. So cool. Daisy Louise was now so shocked that her mouth was wide open and she couldn't close it. Although she had seen Mr. Stark flying in his Iron Man armor many times on television, this was the first time she had seen the Iron Man armor take off so close up. And there was also Jo Young, who flew into the sky dragging a hammer. She felt that this trip was truly worth it, and all her previous dissatisfaction with the environment here had been thrown to the back of her mind. Coulson, on the other hand, was frowning tightly. This was also the first time he had seen Jo Young able to fly using Thor's hammer. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. They still knew very little about Thor's hammer. Jo Young didn't actually go anywhere, he just let Thor's hammer carry him into the clouds above, using Thor's hammer's control over lightning to sense the power of lightning in the atmosphere. Odin's sudden move disrupted Jo Young's plan for increasing his strength. Originally, he hoped to reach the legendary realm through other means to avoid Odin's control over him, but now Thor's hammer's transformation of him has deepened Odin's control over him. Under these circumstances, he had to think about how he would proceed in the future. And all of this depended on the outcome of the current event. There were only two possible outcomes for this matter. Either Thor would retrieve Thor's hammer after the event concluded, the power of the thunder god in Zhou Yang's body would be stripped away, and his own strength would fall back below the legendary realm, not much different from before, just with the breakthrough being more difficult. Or, after the event concluded, the hammer in his hand would still remain with him, still under his control, which could only mean that this hammer was not Thor's hammer at all, but merely a replica. Even if Zhou Yang would still be controlled by Odin, obtaining a replica of Thor's hammer was enough to show Odin's regard for him. In that case, at least in the short term, the power of thunder in Zhou Yang's body would not be stripped away, and Thor's hammer would not be taken away. This meant that in the short term, he couldn't get rid of this power, and if he wanted to continue his path, he had to find a way from this very path. Using thunder as a foundation was absolutely not feasible. He could only use external means, but he could use thunder to gain insight into other magic powers. Thunder can generate fire, thunder can generate wind, thunder can generate rain, thunder can scorch the earth, and thunder can connect with metal. Zhou Yang could use lightning to gain a deeper understanding of the essence of wind, rain, earth, fire, and metal, thus gaining a deeper mastery of their power. As for which element could become the cornerstone of Zhou Yang's future magic path, capable of replacing ice magic and thunder magic, this required Zhou Yang to conduct long-term exploration. However, when Zhou Yang saw Stark, he completely changed his mind. In the entire Marvel universe, the most powerful elemental forces were not metal, wood, water, fire, and earth, nor earth, water, fire, and wind, but time, space, power, reality, mind, and soul. These were the most fundamental laws of the entire universe. Whether it was metal, wood, water, fire, and earth, or earth, water, fire, and wind, their power could not surpass the power of thunder. This meant that if Odin truly targeted Zhou Yang through the power of thunder, he might be able to resist using the former methods, but the probability of ultimate victory was not high. Therefore, at this moment, the part of the cosmic cube's power that Stark possessed was the only thing he could rely on. Whether it was the replica cosmic cube particle arc reactor of Stark and his father, or the light energy engine researched by Marvel using the cosmic cube, these were actually just different interpretations of the cosmic cube's power in certain forms. Zhou Yang had now obtained a considerable amount of information about the replica cosmic cube particle arc reactor. Although Stark likely still held some more core components, preventing Zhou Yang from making a breakthrough in this area, after obtaining Thor's hammer, he could solve these problems in a more microscopic way. And the most crucial point was that the key energy source he had always lacked the ability to connect to was resolved after obtaining Thor's hammer. Countless bolts of lightning constantly darted around Zhou Yang, but none came close to him in the slightest. The power of Thor's hammer completely controlled this lightning. Stark below the clouds could only watch from afar. He had always been wary of entering the clouds, not to mention the powerful lightning that could pierce his Iron Man armor. Just the signal interference that this powerful lightning could cause was unacceptable to him. But now Stark was a little confused. Why was Zhou Yang's attitude so different before and after? Was it merely because of the name Donald Blake? And who was this Donald Blake? Once Stark became interested in someone, all the information about that person's life would be presented to him in the shortest possible time. The artificial intelligence system Jarvis was designed for this very task, fast and with absolutely detailed information. Dr. Donald Blake wasn't particularly special. Although he was a high achiever from Harvard Medical School, due to his own disability, he likely could never perform the most advanced top-tier surgeries, which was why he left the hospital. Otherwise, with his medical skills and background, he might not reach the very top, but he could certainly be an excellent surgical specialist. In fact, in medicine, the more advanced the surgery, the higher the physical requirements for the doctor. Each surgery might require the doctor to stand for several hours, or even a full day. If one's physical condition was slightly poor, they couldn't endure it, let alone if they were disabled. And those surgeries precise to the nanometer level required even more. Moving even a tiny bit more or less could be fatal. A doctor with a physical disability, even if they could stand for a long time, would have posture issues, leading to the failure of the entire surgery. However, based on the information about Dr. Donald Blake's medical skills and background, if he had stayed in the hospital, he could have been an excellent general surgeon, but he definitely couldn't participate in these top-tier surgeries. Some psychological factors made him unable to bear it, so he chose to leave. His only special characteristic was being Dr. Jane Foster's ex-boyfriend, which was how he intersected with them. Stark became suspicious because the information showed no interaction between Jo Young and this Dr. Donald Blake. Furthermore, when Jo Young arrived in New York, Dr. Jane Foster and Dr. Donald Blake had already broken up, and the latter had left New York to travel in Europe. Therefore, unless they had met in Europe, Jo Young should not have met this Dr. Donald Blake at all. Stark keenly sensed the issue here, so he more quickly retrieved relevant information about Donald Blake's trip to Europe. There were no traces of Jo Young interacting with him, but Stark made another discovery. While traveling in Norway, Donald Blake had a police report filed, and even the audio recording of the call at the time still existed. Quote, "There are aliens are kidnapping people, hurry, hurry, hurry." The voice stopped abruptly halfway through. Although Donald Blake's police call recording was as absurd as involving aliens, due to the panic in his tone, the Norwegian police still sent people to search deep in the forest. However, the Norwegian forests are vast, and it's difficult to accurately find a person's location, especially when Donald Blake didn't mention the specific location of the incident, making it even harder to find him. But in the end, they still found Donald Blake, or to be precise, Donald Blake found them. At that time, he was completely disheveled, as if he had fallen off a cliff. However, when asked about the alien kidnapping, Donald Blake only mentioned that he had been mistaken and then dropped the matter. One detail in the police report was very interesting: they did not find his phone on Donald Blake afterward. The police believed he had dropped and lost it during an unfortunate fall, which was why the phone wasn't found. But what if he really encountered aliens? Could they have been those from Norse mythology? On the last page of the police report, Stark saw the exact time of Donald Blake's call, which was the same day Thor's hammer descended in New Mexico. More precisely, the event in New Mexico occurred in the early hours of the morning, while Donald Blake's call was made during the day. No, considering the time difference between Norway and New Mexico, frankly speaking, they were at the same time. Looking up at Jo Young in the clouds at this moment, endless thunder and lightning surrounded him completely. Perhaps he was indeed doing some kind of power connection, but Stark believed he was mostly avoiding him, not wanting him to know more about Donald Blake. At this point, Stark had already instructed Jarvis to retrieve the satellite information from the time Donald Blake made the police call. He could use the relevant information to accurately pinpoint Donald Blake's exact location when he called. "It's here." The next moment, Stark didn't hesitate at all and flew directly to the northeast. He wanted to see what had happened in that place, whether aliens had truly landed again, or if something else had occurred. Although Jo Young's attention was mostly focused on the power of thunder around him at this moment, the energy disturbance caused by Stark's departure still caught his attention. It seemed that the unusual reaction he showed when he first heard the name Donald Blake had indeed caught Stark's attention. But let him notice, Donald Blake couldn't hide in New York forever, he would always have to face his destiny. Of course, perhaps Jo Young was wrong, perhaps Donald Blake wasn't the person Jo Young thought he was, but that was the only way. Dr. Jane Foster, although dedicated to her research, couldn't help but feel a bit frustrated after a long time with no results. When she saw the last message on her phone, she hesitated repeatedly, but ultimately decided to return to New York first. After all, it was 4 years of feelings. Stark left quietly because Jo Young hadn't come down from high altitude for 3 consecutive days, and this time he had deliberately shielded his radar signal, so even SHIELD's monitoring personnel didn't detect his departure. That's right, Stark had now started installing a stealth system on his Iron Man armor, which indicated a significant step forward in his armor's capabilities. However, with Stark's flamboyant personality, the stealth capability of the Iron Man armor made little difference. As time gradually passed, Jo Young still hadn't come down from high altitude. If it weren't for the constant presence of that dark cloud and the continuous flashing of lightning within it, they might have truly suspected that Jo Young had already left. But even so, they couldn't help but be amazed, because from the current situation, Jo Young had reached the legendary realm of Bigu, abstaining from grains, food. Although Westerners couldn't accurately describe this realm, by not eating for such a long time, Jo Young had gradually shed his mortal status. The greatest benefit of Thor's hammer to Jo Young was actually the transformation this power brought to Jo Young's body. In the past, although Jo Young was a powerful magician, close combat had never been his strong suit. You might see him fighting close quarters with Hulk, but look at Hulk, he had no brains and knew very little about combat techniques. However, Jo-young had completely filled this weakness at this moment. Even if Odin were to withdraw the power of thunder from his body in the future, Jo-young could completely rely on his own physical condition to display legendary level combat ability. Just like Thor now, even if Thor lost Thor's hammer, he would still be one of the most powerful superhumans on this planet. However, had Thor truly lost Thor's hammer? Many people who knew Dr. Donald Blake knew he was a good person, but it was a shame that because of his disability, he couldn't participate in top-tier surgical procedures, leading him to leave the hospital in disappointment. However, few people knew that the real reason Blake left the hospital wasn't this. In fact, even with his disability, the resilient will forged through several years of arduous training had long since allowed him to nearly overcome this difficulty. Even standing for long periods was manageable, as long as it wasn't an exceptionally long surgery lasting over 12 hours, he could successfully perform it. It was precisely because of this that he was accepted by a top hospital, progressing from intern to resident, then to chief physician, and continuing to advance. The reason he was forced to leave the hospital was actually due to a surgery. To be precise, it was an unauthorized surgery. He performed a procedure on a patient who was on the verge of death, but this surgery had not been approved by the hospital's medical department because the patient couldn't afford the medical expenses. $90,000 in medical expenses was not something an ordinary person could afford, but for this, Blake ultimately went ahead with the surgery, an unauthorized one. Fortunately, the surgery was ultimately successful, and the child was saved, but Dr. Donald Blake was fired. It wasn't because of the $90,000, but because it was unauthorized. Doing it once might have been acceptable, but if done repeatedly over the long term, no hospital could tolerate it. It was precisely because of this that Dr. Donald Blake was fired. And it was because of this dismissal that while strolling in New York Central Park, Donald Blake happened to meet Jane Foster, who was out for a run. They met, got to know each other, and eventually fell in love. To be honest, Donald Blake still had some assets. A top neurosurgeon is quite lucrative. Speaking of which, both Donald Blake and Strange were top neurosurgeons in New York, and they should have known each other. The circle of top neurosurgeons is only so big, and everyone is in New York. This profession really tends to produce superheroes, and they are all very powerful. Donald Blake himself holds dual citizenship in America and Norway. He owns a castle in his hometown in Norway, and opening a clinic in New York was not difficult for him. He could afford the investment of a few million US. However, this money couldn't be entirely his alone. As his girlfriend and also as an investment, Jane Foster also invested $1 million in this clinic. This was the prize money from various awards she had received over the years, as well as the royalties and copyrights from the many articles and papers she had published. She also held a significant amount of shares in this clinic. But for so many years, this clinic has never paid a single dividend because it has never made money. Dr. Donald Blake often directly waived all medical fees for patients who couldn't afford them, and sometimes even used his own money in medicine. If it weren't for his outstanding ability, which allowed him to earn a considerable amount from wealthy people, this clinic would have closed down long ago. Standing at the entrance of the clinic, Jane Foster thought about everything from the past, finally sighing softly, then pushed the door open and walked in. "Hi, Lena." Jane Foster greeted the nurses familiarly and casually asked, "Is he inside?" "Yes, there's a patient." Lena nodded slightly, motioned for Jane Foster to come over, and then lowered her voice to ask, "Did you two break up again?" Again, a bitter smile appeared on Jane Foster's face. The word, again, was used perfectly. Breaking up and getting back together with Donald Blake wasn't the first or second time, and it seemed like this time was the same, but Jane Foster knew in her heart that this time was different. Even if her research in New Mexico didn't yield more breakthroughs this time, the data she had obtained was already enough for her to conduct research for a considerable amount of time. Therefore, she would be immersed in scientific research for a long time to come. If Donald Blake couldn't accept this, then perhaps they would have to break up. And this time, she would be absolutely decisive, even directly withdrawing her investment in this clinic. Without this money, the clinic would likely struggle to survive. This clinic actually has quite a few patients. After all, besides some completely free clinics, this place is one of the few in New York with the lowest fees, even lower than some community clinics. Although this is a clinic specializing in neurological and psychological issues, many patients with other ailments also come here for treatment, and Donald Blake does his best to treat every patient. To be honest, if they didn't charge the minimum fees for medicine and equipment, even more people would come, and this clinic would have closed down long ago. Even so, several batches of nurses have already left, and now only Lena and Elaine remain. And they are also recent graduates who couldn't find jobs. Once they find jobs with higher salaries and better prospects than here, they might leave soon. Jane Foster had also suggested raising the medical fees when necessary to keep the clinic afloat as much as possible. But Donald Blake stubbornly refused her, saying that if the medical fees increased by even $1, it could potentially prevent someone from affording treatment and ultimately lead to their death. That was a human life. But Jane Foster's reason was also very strong. She said that if this clinic really couldn't continue, then even more people would not be able to be saved. Donald Blake gritted his teeth and insisted that he would save as many as he could, even if he was the only one left in the clinic. In the end, he would keep it going. He was a stubborn mule. Although they were separated for a long time, neither of them had the time or inclination to find other men or women. More of their time was spent on their respective professions, so the real reasons for their breakup were elsewhere. After the patient from the consultation room came out, Jane Foster asked Lena to stop the next patient and then walked to the door of the consultation room. With her hand on the doorknob of the consultation room, Jane Foster couldn't help but hesitate for a moment. Did she really want to do this? Finally, she walked in with a determined look, and looking at Donald Blake, who was clearly surprised by her appearance, she said, "Don, we need to talk." Unexpectedly, Donald Blake's expression quickly calmed down. He nodded and said calmly, "We certainly do need to talk." A moment later, the two of them were in Central Park, not far from the clinic, slowly walking along the path they were accustomed to. "Don, don't blame me. This time, I had no choice but to withdraw my investment because my new research requires a large amount of funding," Jane Foster said calmly, but her heart was extremely heavy. How could she not want the clinic to continue? However, Donald Blake's reaction was unusually calm. He nodded, to Jane Foster's utter surprise, and said, "You're right, Jane. Perhaps it's time for this clinic to end." "Why, isn't it your dream?" Jane Foster stopped abruptly, unable to resist grabbing Donald Blake's arm tightly. "It is my dream, but a clinic like this absolutely cannot be run by a mentally ill person," Donald Blake said, then couldn't help but let out a long sigh, finally subconsciously looking at the cane in his left hand. Wait, what mentally ill person? What are you talking about? When did you become mentally ill?" Jane Foster quickly grasped the core of the problem and looked at Donald Blake with a serious expression. "What exactly is wrong with you?" "I'm also very troubled. I suspect I have another personality inside me." Donald Blake began to tell Jane Foster the entire process of how he developed a dual personality. "It all started with my trip to Norway this time." The last time Jane Foster and Donald Blake broke up, they had a fierce argument, and both were very unhappy. So after Jane Foster left New York, Donald Blake also returned to Norway to relax. "I saw an alien spaceship, and they were kidnapping a girl, so I quickly called the police. But when I called the police, those aliens discovered me and chased after me. While I was running away, I accidentally fell into a cave." According to Donald Blake's description, everything started from this cave. The aliens also chased him into the cave. At the most critical moment, Donald Blake could only use the cane in his hand to resist the enemy. However, just as he was about to be killed by the alien, a rumbling sound of thunder came from the sky, and the next moment, the cane in his hand had become blazing white. Blinding lightning shot out from the cane in his hand, and the powerful electric current instantly caused the alien to scream in pain, then fall to the ground, foaming at the mouth. However, at this moment, more aliens chased in, but the cane in Donald Blake's hand had already turned into a huge hammer, an incredibly powerful Thor's hammer. Looking again, Donald Blake had disappeared, and in the eyes of those aliens, there appeared a powerful warrior wearing silver armor, a silver helmet, and a bright red cape. This person was none other than Thor. The rest goes without saying. Thor descended, wielding Thor's hammer, and defeated the aliens in the shortest amount of time, then rushed out. However, just as he was about to rescue the girl, she had vanished. Instead, the aliens, somehow, had returned to their spaceship and left in a hurry. Finally, besides the signs of a struggle on the ground, there was no other evidence of aliens kidnapping Earth humans, which is why the case was ultimately dropped. I remember him saying, "You ask who I am. I am the noise of rain, the will of the wind." The world calls me the messenger of thunder, the singer of lightning. I am the next god king of the Aesir, the son of All-Father Odin. I am Thor. Donald Blake recalled carefully, frowning, and continued. He also said something like, "Father, I have returned," afterwards, and then he fainted. At this point, Jane Foster, who heard Donald Blake's description, had already turned extremely pale. Just 2 days ago, she was still researching Thor's hammer in the New Mexico desert, but now, her ex-boyfriend Donald Blake had suddenly become Thor, and the cane in his hand had also turned into Thor's hammer. This means that Joe Young was right when he said at the New Mexico base that the object they were researching was not Thor's hammer, but merely a replica. The real Thor's hammer was still in Thor's hand. Jane, that feeling was so real, every feeling was so real. I held lightning in my hand, felt every drop of rain fall, felt like I was the rain, I was everything, I was connected to the entire universe. This feeling was too intense, I couldn't bear it. It swallowed me whole. Donald Blake's face had turned somewhat pale, and as he said this, that feeling from back then seemed to return. I don't quite understand. Jane Foster's face also turned somewhat awkward. She reached out and supported Donald Blake, saying softly and concernedly, "Let's go rest over there, Don. You're not looking well." "It's okay, Jane. I've gradually cleared my thoughts during this time." Donald Blake forced a smile and then said to Jane Foster, "Perhaps this cane released some radiation on me, or some kind of cosmic ray, just like the Fantastic Four. The rays enhanced my body and senses, strengthening them to a point my consciousness couldn't accept, and as a compensatory mechanism, I developed a divine personality. At that time, my perception was beyond words. I could distinguish colors I had never known, I could hear every drop of rain fall, I could feel every muscle coordinating perfectly. I was the lightning, I was the sound of thunder. At that moment, I was a god, I had a god's vision." Looking at the rambling Donald Blake before her, Jane Foster felt incredibly absurd for a moment. Their team was still in New Mexico studying a Thor's hammer of unknown origin, but here, her ex-boyfriend was claiming to possess the personality of a god, the personality of Thor, that he himself was Thor. The impact of all this was simply too great for her. However, Donald Blake's next sentence immediately brought the incredulous Jane Foster, who had covered her mouth in astonishment, back to reality. "This is a typical schizophrenic reaction, Jane. When you feel like a god, you start believing you are one." Donald Blake laughed like a child. "This is indeed too crazy." Jane Foster also started laughing, rationality completely returning at this moment. Walking and chatting, the two slowly returned to the clinic entrance. Jane Foster analyzed seriously, saying, "But that wasn't you. That was the Norse mythology thunder god you kept talking about. You didn't even look like yourself. Vikings and all that." Donald Blake was relaxed now. Pushing the door open, he said, "I don't know if it's because I was obsessed with them when I was a kid, but I don't have many memories of the past. Have you ever dreamed that you could actually fly and couldn't understand how you forgot? That's how I feel, remembering that I am Thor, remembering that Donald Blake was just a role I played." Following behind Donald Blake and pushing the door, Jane Foster felt as if cold water had been poured over her head at that moment. She froze in place, her mouth slightly agape, wanting to say something, but ultimately no sound came out. At this moment, Donald Blake didn't notice Jane Foster's reaction. He raised his cane and continued, "And the problem now is, what to do with this stick? I have no clue about it. I want to study it." "No, Don." Jane Foster jolted, instantly reacting. She grabbed her ex-boyfriend's arm, pleading with extreme firmness, "No, Don, please, don't touch it anymore. Either throw it away or give it to professionals to study. You have no idea what you're messing with." The night Loki attacked the Thor's hammer base, Jane Foster fainted immediately and had no memory of anything that happened afterward. But most of SHIELD's surveillance equipment was still functioning normally that night, faithfully recording everything it saw. After waking up, Jane Foster had also carefully watched the surveillance video. Tony Stark and Joe Young had shown themselves to be powerful enough, but the Loki who kept attacking them appeared even more relaxed and casual. In the end, they didn't even know how Loki disappeared. Joe Young finally had a chance to heavily injure Loki, but with that convergence of power, there was nothing near Thor's hammer. Even if that person was Loki from Norse mythology, perhaps he is Loki from Norse mythology, and his strength is already so formidable. Then how terrifying would Thor, who is even stronger than him, be if he unleashed his full power? At that time, would her Donald Blake still exist? Even if he did, would it be Donald Blake or Thor? I really think you should get rid of it. I have some friends who are studying related fields, why don't you? Jane Foster was still trying to convince Donald Blake to give up his cane, but Donald Blake's attitude was as stubborn as ever. I won't be foolish, Jane, I promise, Donald Blake said, holding his cane, both comforting and pleading. Please don't tell anyone about this. What if some crazy criminal steals it and transforms into a god like Zeus? I'm not joking, Jane Foster said anxiously. Can we please stop dwelling on these things and just focus on running the clinic? Donald Blake looked at Jane Foster with a half-smile, the meaning in his words perfectly clear. Jane Foster became somewhat embarrassed and angry. You know what the point is, Don. The clinic, remember, that was your dream, not that broken wooden stick. Do you really think it's more important than your clinic? Nothing is more important to me than the clinic, Jane. Donald Blake suddenly reached out and took Jane Foster's hand, saying somewhat emotionally, to be honest, you are just as important to me. HMPH. Jane Foster snorted coldly with a straight face, trying to pull her hand away, but Donald Blake held on tightly. She couldn't pull it back, and honestly, she wasn't using much strength herself. Donald Blake took the opportunity to pull hard, bringing Jane Foster back into his arms. The two got closer and closer. More than half an hour later, Jane Foster and Donald Blake walked out of the clinic office. Since they had gone for a walk in Central Park earlier, most patients had already left. Donald Blake held Jane Foster's hand and happily said to everyone, I'm sorry we can't pop the champagne now, but I've decided to open tomorrow morning. We're off this afternoon. Congratulations, you two have made up again, haha. But I must remind you, you're responsible for cleaning the office yourselves, no one will do it for you. Nurse Lena's words made Jane Foster's face turn bright red again. Just as the clinic was starting to feel a bit relaxed, there was a bang as the clinic door was violently pushed open. A tall, muscular man with a long black beard and wearing a black coat strode into the clinic. He held a gun in his right hand and was supporting a young blonde man with his left, pressing tightly against the young man's chest, which was bleeding profusely. Undoubtedly, these two had just been in a gunfight. The young blonde man had no strength left, and his breathing was shallow. He was dragging on the ground, blood dripping from outside the clinic all the way in. The entire clinic instantly tensed up. A gunshot rang out, making everyone's bodies tremble. The tall man with the long beard held the gun tightly, frowning, and said coldly and anxiously, I need a doctor right now, miss, hurry up with that. Try to call the police. Donald Blake pressed Jane Foster down, then stood up from his chair. He leaned on his cane with one hand and raised the other to show he was harmless. Then he said to the man with the beard, I'm the doctor at this clinic. Lena, quickly help this young man onto the bed and check his blood pressure. After all, this was Manhattan, where light and darkness intersected. One side was the bustling Hollywood Boulevard, while behind the tall buildings, countless criminal acts occurred every day. Not only was Donald Blake familiar with all of this, but Jane Foster was also no stranger. Imperial University was one of New York's top universities, but now, across the street from Imperial University, on the other side of the park, was New York's most notorious slum. It was all right during the day, but late at night, students from the university didn't dare linger on the streets outside, because you never knew when, perhaps with just a bit of bad luck, you could be kidnapped or even hit by a stray bullet. These were things that had happened before. Just as Donald Blake was cutting open the young blonde man's shirt to treat him, the bearded man behind him suddenly couldn't help but speak. My son and I went to do a job, but a bank guard got brave and fired a shot. He hit my son, my child, so I took his life. So, doctor, you must save him. His gunshot wound is very severe, he's bleeding internally. I don't know what I can do, I'm missing a lot of things here. He should be sent to the emergency room right now. Donald Blake wiped his forehead with the back of his only clean hand, then turned to look at the bearded man. It's not that complicated, doctor. The bearded man's gun suddenly came up, pointed directly at Donald Blake, his eyes filled with pain, ferocity, and coldness as he stared at him. You save him, and you live. If he dies, I'll kill you. He's my only son. If he dies, nothing else matters. Donald Blake frowned tightly, glaring angrily at the bearded man, then turned back and quickly began operating on the young man. There was no other way. The young man's wound was bleeding very fast. If the source of the bleeding couldn't be quickly found and sutured to stop it, he would die soon. Furthermore, in this clinic, aside from Donald Blake himself, no one else had performed surgery. No one else could help him at all. This was not hard to understand. Doctors like them performing surgery always formed a team with a few familiar doctors to operate together. Some nurses were even borrowed from hospitals, or more accurately, when they performed surgery, they were all underground surgeries. A clinic like theirs was not qualified to perform surgery. Just as Donald Blake was fully focused on the surgery, the piercing sound of police sirens suddenly blared. The police had arrived. "You are surrounded, come out and surrender immediately. We know you're inside," the police outside shouted through a loudspeaker, but the bearded man inside just frowned, muttering impatiently, "What a bunch of persistent moles." Jane Foster glanced at Donald Blake and shook her head slightly. The police here were not called by her, she hadn't had time to press the alarm. The police must have tracked the blood trail on the ground. At this moment, Donald was still completely focused on the surgery, seemingly unaffected by what was happening outside. Moreover, at this moment, Jane Foster suddenly felt the bearded man's gaze fall upon her. Before she could do anything, the bearded man took large strides and grabbed her. Feeling the cold gun muzzle pressed against her forehead, Jane Foster immediately stopped all struggle. She knew that at this moment, she absolutely could not provoke the other party, otherwise, if the other party went mad and lost control, anything could happen. Such incidents had been reported on television too many times. "Listen to me, I have 4 innocent people here. I'm going to shoot one of them right now, no jokes. If you dare to make a move, I'll kill the rest." The ruthless bearded man made a cruel decision at this moment. He was going to kill Jane Foster. Not good. Jane Foster was not worried about her own safety at this moment, because at this instant, she knew that the bearded man's actions had provoked someone who should not have been provoked. The rumble of thunder sounded, and Jane Foster knew in her heart that it was already too late. "Let go of that woman, coward. I won't say it a second time." Thor's voice was very different from Donald Blake's. At this moment, Jane Foster, held hostage by the bearded man, was turned around and saw Thor, wearing a silver helmet, silver armor, and a red cape. Jane Foster's eyes were only on Thor, she didn't care what else was happening. And almost in the blink of an eye, the bearded man holding her hostage was struck by the spinning Thor's hammer and sent flying, crashing heavily against the wall, causing cracks to appear in the wall. At this point, Jane Foster had been rescued by Thor. Thor placed her on a chair, nodded silently, and then turned and walked out. Walking out of the clinic, facing over a dozen heavily armed police officers. New Mexico, above the thunder, Thor's hammer was already in Zhou Yang's hand, held between his chest and abdomen. Countless thunderbolts constantly darted around Zhou Yang's body, but he himself remained seated there with his eyes closed, without any sign of life. Suddenly, Thor's hammer, which was held between Zhou Yang's chest and abdomen, began to shake violently. Zhou Yang instantly opened his eyes, gripping Thor's hammer tightly in his hand, while his gaze was directed towards the direction of New York to the northeast. At the same time that Thor appeared in New York, Zhou Yang also sensed Thor's presence through his own Thor's hammer, and even the image of Thor holding Thor's hammer completely appeared in his mind. Indeed, Thor was still on this earth, and that person was undoubtedly Donald Blake. He went nowhere else, but specifically to New York, a city of sin. No matter how powerful you are, New York is like a giant stone roller that can always crush sin to your side. Thor, who possesses great power, is like an all in a bag, always having a day when he will shine. So as long as Thor is in New York, he will eventually reveal his whereabouts. In this situation, the attention of both S.H.I.E.L.D. and Loki will be drawn to New York. In other words, from the moment this news was calculated, Zhou Yang's side was completely safe. Even if the fake Thor's hammer had some attraction to Loki, it was far less than Thor, with whom he had always had a love-hate relationship. These things can be thrown out of mind. The problem now is the Thor's hammer in his hand. Even though they were thousands of kilometers apart, from the moment Thor appeared in this world, this fake Thor's hammer was still greatly affected by him. This means that as long as Thor is willing, he can retrieve this fake Thor's hammer at any time. This is indeed a fake Thor's hammer, and this fake Thor's hammer will eventually be lost. Although he had already thought of this point, when he confirmed it, Zhou Yang still felt a pang of sadness in his heart. He did have several items in his hand, but these items were only barely enough for him, who had just entered the legendary realm. To unleash more powerful magic, Jo-young needed to invest more magic power and spend more time compared to others who possessed top-tier magic artifacts. Originally, after returning to Earth, his power had been suppressed below the legendary realm. He had thought that during the process of him returning to the legendary realm, he would have enough time to find powerful magic artifacts that would allow him to fully utilize his strength. However, now Thor's hammer had forcibly brought him to the legendary realm. Although the magic he unleashed was more powerful than before, it was even more difficult to fully utilize his strength. No need to rush, he has only just returned to Earth not long ago, and there is still plenty of time to find things that will allow him to exert greater power. This is this fake Thor's hammer, what a pity. Jo-young's glimmer of hope in his heart was completely shattered at this moment. However, in these short few days, Jo-young did gain something. At the very least, through the powerful energy of Thor's hammer and the constantly gathering lightning around him, he took a big step forward in his research on new elements. As long as he figures out a few key points, he will be able to extract new magic elements from nature and create new magic. Jo-young tried to close his eyes to continue thinking and comprehending, but the constantly shaking Thor's hammer, even after it stopped shaking, still made it impossible for Jo-young's heart to completely calm down. It seemed that he needed to take a break. A lightning bolt flashed high in the sky, and in the next moment, Jo-young was gone. A flash of electric sparks, and without anyone noticing, Jo-young had reappeared in the newly built small building. This time, they also used composite simple steel plates to build this small building, but the current small building is twice as large as the previous one, with many more rooms inside, and it looks very transparent, but secretly, more mechanisms have been arranged. However, whether such a mechanism can be effective against Loki is still very difficult to say, and it may not be possible to confirm this in the future, because once Loki gets the information that Thor is in New York, he will immediately rush to New York, and there will be no more trouble here. Of course, such a thing has not yet spread here, but it won't be long. It just depends on when Coulson leaves. Now Stark and Jane Foster have all left, only Professor Shagav is still busy. Jo-young did not disturb him. This Professor Shagav is also a wonderful person. In order to find the secrets of the 9 realms of the World Tree System, he later appeared naked in Stonehenge on the outskirts of London. Wait, Stonehenge, in the Marvel Universe, that is also a very important event location. Maybe there are really many secrets hidden there. It seems that if there is a chance, he will have to go there as well. Jo-young took a paper cup and walked to the water dispenser to get some water, but he saw Daisy Louise sitting on the chair, constantly nodding but almost asleep. Although she is not from a related major, she has tried her best to learn relevant knowledge in the past few days. Not to mention anything else, her intelligence is not a problem, otherwise it would be impossible for her to be admitted to Imperial University. You have to say that after a long period of cultivation, being able to see a young woman who looks quite good and has a very attractive figure is indeed very pleasing to the eye, makes people feel happy, and the pressure on the body is also reduced a lot. And the most important thing is that she is now sitting on the chair, leaning slightly forward, with saliva flowing from the corner of her mouth. Jo-young reached out and extended his hand towards Daisy Louise. Hey, wake up, wake up. Jo-young called out several times before waking up Daisy Louise, and then said with a gentle smile, if you are very sleepy, then go back and rest, you don't have to stay here. By the way, there's also. Jo-young reached out and wiped the corner of his mouth. Daisy Louise, who woke up groggily, subconsciously touched the corner of her mouth, and then wiped it a little harder, with a dazed look, which made Jo-young unable to help but laugh. Alright, go and rest, haha. Amidst the laughter, Jo-young had already waved Thor's hammer and rushed towards the sky again. Ah! A scream of embarrassment and anger came from the small building below. Jo-young, who was holding Thor's hammer and flying towards the sky, also couldn't help but laugh loudly at the same time. He has figured it out. For him at this time, it is not to go back and participate in the messy things in New York, but to make the most of the power of the fake Thor's hammer in his hand to break through some key points in his cultivation. In this way, even if this fake Thor's hammer is taken away in the future, and the power of thunder brought by this fake Thor's hammer is stripped away, Jo-young will still gain something. At the very least, the relevant insights will be deeply engraved in his consciousness forever. The power of thunder, even if he does not master the thunder rune, he can still unleash it through his comprehension during this period. This has already involved a different system of power outside the rune magic system. Jo Young guessed correctly. Coulson soon received a situation report from New York. Thor had appeared in New York. The intelligence was very detailed. Thor appeared in Jane Foster's ex-boyfriend Donald Blake's clinic. An attempted robbery resulted in the robber's injury, which eventually affected their clinic. Jane Foster was unfortunately taken hostage by the robber, and at this critical moment, Thor appeared. Thor descended, holding Thor's hammer, easily dealt with the sudden appearance of the robber, and then left with his head held high. Several details here are very important. First, Thor was holding Thor's hammer, which finally proved that the Thor's hammer they had here was fake, something Jo Young had mentioned before. Second, that Thor did not have a good temper. When faced with the New York police's guns, he did not choose to lay down his weapon and surrender but directly smashed a police car and then flew away. Finally, that Thor was very fast, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Afterward, neither S.H.I.E.L.D. nor the police could find any trace of him, meaning he is now nowhere to be found. At this time in New York, Natasha Romanoff, who was closest, had already been assigned to investigate. Simultaneously, Nick Fury also requested Coulson to immediately head to New York because, if all went as expected, the person they had previously identified as Loki would also soon appear in New York. Judging from Loki's previous attack on S.H.I.E.L.D., attempting to steal the fake Thor's hammer, Loki clearly held strong malice towards Thor. This meant that once Loki found Thor, a divine battle was very likely to break out in New York. Logically, at this time, they should gather all available forces, but Nick Fury's order to Coulson was to leave quietly alone, without alarming Jo Young in New Mexico. No one knew what would happen if Jo Young, holding the fake Thor's hammer, appeared in New York. What they needed least right now was a third person to stir up trouble. As for the potential appearance of Thor and Loki in New York, S.H.I.E.L.D. had its own plans. Don't forget, Tony Stark had already returned to New York, plus the Fantastic Four who were always in New York, Professor Charles from the Mutant Academy, and S.H.I.E.L.D.'s own strongest trump card. They were confident they could handle this situation. Originally, Coulson wanted to chat with Jo Young for a bit, but he found that he still hadn't come down from the clouds, so he could only leave alone. Jo Young didn't care about Coulson's departure at all. For him now, the most important thing was to use the fake Thor's hammer in his hand to comprehend the power of the surrounding lightning and other types of magic. Although this Thor's hammer was fake, the powerful force attached to it was real. No weapon Jo Young had ever seen could compare to this fake Thor's hammer. It was undoubtedly a divine artifact. However, the real Thor's hammer was even more powerful, far exceeding the fake Thor's hammer in Jo Young's hand. So, as long as Thor still had Thor's hammer, Loki would never be his opponent. Loki's defeat, Thor's return to Asgard, and the fake Thor's hammer in Jo Young's hand being taken away, this was the outcome Jo Young predicted for the battle in New York. Therefore, he had to seize the time to utilize this fake Thor's hammer. His time was running out. And at this time, almost no one knew where Thor was, except Jane Foster. In fact, Thor hadn't gone anywhere, he had just gone home, back to the apartment Jane Foster and Donald Blake rented. It was quite interesting. Jane Foster had originally come back this time to completely break up with Donald Blake and move out all of her belongings from the apartment. But now, with so much happening, the breakup had long been forgotten. There were more important things to face now. Jane had seen what happened outside the clinic today very clearly. The main reason Thor attacked the police was that the police had acted first. One of their rookie officers got nervous and shot at Thor. Thor only destroyed one of their police cars in retaliation. However, it was clear that Thor's temper was much more volatile than Donald Blake's. Compared to the habitually patient and kind Donald Blake, Thor was more flamboyant, more direct, and impulsive, as if all the negative factors in Donald Blake's heart had been released. So, what Donald Blake said about a second personality of a god appearing in his heart was true. No, things weren't that simple. If not for everything that happened in New Mexico, Jane Foster might have thought that was the case. But after experiencing all that, she understood that things were far from simple. Especially since today's events were on the television news, it was possible that Loki now knew about this and had even come to New York. It seemed these matters needed to be explained clearly to Donald Blake, otherwise, if Loki launched a sudden attack, something might go wrong. Jane Foster, I need to talk to you. Thor's voice came from outside the open window. Jane was startled and turned around to see Thor flying in the air outside, holding onto the edge of the window with one hand. How did you? Oh, you're Thor. Jane Foster slapped her forehead and beckoned, saying, come in. I value you greatly, which is why I came to you for help. It was difficult for Thor's tall body to squeeze through such a narrow window. Thor put down Thor's hammer in his hand and looked at Jane Foster with a serious expression, saying, my memory has returned. It was my brother Loki who betrayed me. Father has banished me. Although Thor was somewhat reckless and impulsive, he was not foolish. Otherwise, his strength would not have far surpassed Loki's. In a place like Asgard, personal might was the fundamental factor that determined everything. Thor was a person who had almost become the god king of Asgard. So, looking back at everything that happened, there was no doubt that Loki's instigation played a part, ultimately leading to his direct banishment to Earth. Yes, he was too impulsive that day, so impulsive that he thought he was already the god king of Asgard, which made him recklessly provoke Father Odin, ultimately leading to his direct banishment by his father. And before that, Loki had constantly whispered in his ear, suggesting that he was the one who truly needed to make the decisions. He had been praised to his downfall. Whenever he thought back on it, the calmed-down Thor couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. Father, right, Father. I must go back and warn him. Thor suddenly turned his head, staring intently at Jane Foster and asked, do you know any reliable wizard? I cannot summon the Rainbow Bridge now, and Heimdall, whose eyes are like a hawk's, ignores me. There must be a sage or perhaps a priest of the Odin ritual who has collected a treasure that can help me. If Jo Young were here, he would immediately think of the cosmic cube hidden in the Norwegian temple back then. And now, it seemed that Thor was not entirely ignorant of such things either. After all, he had almost taken Odin's place. As for everything Thor said, Jane Foster understood only vaguely. She shook her head and said, I don't know any wizard. I can't help you, but I need you to use your hammer to turn yourself back into dawn, just like you did in Norway. Why should I do that? I've just cleared my head. Thor refused back then. What he needed now was to return to Asgard as quickly as possible. Why? Because this is my home. I'm not used to having a deity walking around in my house. It's too terrifying. You're scaring me. Jane Foster's face remained tense the entire time because she was increasingly certain that the person in front of her was not her ex-boyfriend at all, but Thor. Hearing Jane Foster say this, Thor was stunned for a moment. It was impossible for him to be completely unaware of the relationship between Donald Blake and Jane Foster, but the defensive posture she was showing him now was not good. After a moment of contemplation, Thor finally spoke, if doing so will make you trust me, then I will comply. Know that doing this is not easy. With that, Thor looked deeply at Jane Foster. The next moment, Thor's hammer in his hand had struck the floor hard, but the powerful Thor's hammer did not cause any damage to the floor, only leaving a faint black scorch mark. At the same time, a blinding flash of lightning erupted, forcing Jane Foster to close her eyes for an instant. Thor had completely disappeared, and standing before Jane Foster was none other than Donald Blake, holding a wooden staff and wearing surgical scrubs. Dawn, quick, get up. We need to leave here immediately. We need to find my friends for help. Jane Foster anxiously grabbed Donald Blake, who was still in a half-kneeling posture. She had to take him to New Mexico while he was still in the Donald Blake state, to find Tony Stark, Jo Young, and Professor Eric Selvig to quickly resolve this matter. At this moment, Loki might have already arrived. Only by exploiting this time difference could they avoid Loki's pursuit. Otherwise, once Loki caught up, the consequences would be unpredictable. No, Jane, it's not like that. Donald Blake grabbed Jane Foster's hand and said sincerely, he means no harm to me. What? Jane Foster's eyes widened as she looked at Donald Blake. Suddenly, she backed away several steps, her eyes filled with disappointment as she said, do you know? Just 10 seconds ago, he was here asking me where he could find a wizard to help him return to Asgard. I don't care how important he is, he's much stronger than you. I don't want to see you taken hostage by him. This is definitely not cosmic radiation, it's something from another world. I know, that's what I've been trying to tell you. Donald Blake stepped forward, placed his hands on Jane Foster's shoulders, and said with extreme seriousness, I understand, it sounds crazy, but I think Thor is real. To be honest, I can really feel it, we are the same person. What are you even talking about? Jane Foster shook off Donald Blake's hand, shouting angrily and emotionally, you are Donald Blake, a kind-hearted, excellent surgeon. You are not a Norse god. I like you, I really like you, Dawn. Please, please stop being crazy, stop touching that broken stick. It's not that simple, Jane, Donald Blake said with extreme bitterness. I'm telling you, I don't remember my parents, I don't remember my childhood. I don't know which elementary school I attended or who I was close to. I don't have the memories a human should have right now. All I have in my mind are things from Asgard, as if my life was meant to be that way, and my own existence feels less real. This was Donald Blake's biggest problem. After Thor appeared, he had gradually overridden his original memories. After all, compared to Thor's more than 1,000 years, Donald Blake's mere less than 30 years of experience was like a drop in the ocean. Because of this, we should leave here immediately and find my friends for help. Only then can you return to normal. Jane Foster never wanted to see Thor. She had never liked Thor. All she ever wanted was Donald Blake. However, things are never that simple. The next day, the newspapers were filled with news about Thor, especially the Daily Bugle's editor J. Jonah Jameson, who couldn't stop praising him. I saw a real man. And the same newspaper also fell into Loki's hands. He had just bought it from a street newsstand. New York newsstand. I hope everyone will support it and subscribe for more videos.